In medieval Europe, few words inspired as much fear as leper. For centuries, those afflicted with leprosy, what we now know as Hansen's disease, were shunned, cast out, and forced to live apart from the rest of society. What did they eat? Who cared for them? Did they work, love, laugh, or simply wait to die? Leprosy was not just seen as a disease of the body, but as a punishment from God, a mark of sin, or even a sign of inner corruption. And so, behind high walls or beyond the edge of town, leper colonies, also called leprosaria, became places of both suffering and survival. But what was life really like inside those colonies? Beyond the myths, the whispers, and the religious judgment, how did people live day to day? In this video, we'll step inside the world of the medieval leper colony and walk alongside those who were exiled by illness. You'll hear their stories not as legends, but as lived experiences, quiet, painful, resilient, and deeply human. Through 20 immersive sections, we'll explore the forgotten rhythms of a life lived on the margins. This isn't a story of death. It's a story of what it meant to live when the world no longer wanted you. It often began with something small. A pale patch on the skin that did not hurt, did not itch, numb, if anything, or a strange tingling sensation in the fingers. To suffer from it was to be marked by God, punished for sin, cursed in a way that set you apart, not only in body, but in spirit. This belief was deeply rooted in both religious teachings and popular superstition. In some places, a symbolic funeral was performed. The leper would lie in a coffin, covered in a shroud, while a priest recited prayers for the dead. In many regions, it followed a strict form. The leper would be brought to the steps of a church. It tore them from everything they knew: home, livelihood, kin, the rhythms of ordinary existence. Those afflicted often had to walk alone. They wore clothing that signified their condition, a hood that covered much of the face, gloves to conceal disfigurement. They smeared herbs on their skin. They avoided priests and healers. In poor regions, they were simply pointed down the road. And though the church claimed to act in mercy, separating the lepers, to prevent the spread of disease, and to care for them in spiritual community, the reality was often abandonment cloaked in ritual. They withdrew slowly from society, hoping no one would notice the change. Others were denounced, accused by neighbors, betrayed by friends. You were now the leper from the South End, or the one who begs by the bridge. Some lepers were branded with a cross on their clothing, stitched or dyed into the back or sleeve. Some were allowed to stay with family until symptoms worsened. Others were hidden by loved ones, cared for in secret. There were whispers of healers in remote villages who claimed to know herbal treatments. There were saints who were prayed to for relief. Saint Lazarus, in particular, became a patron of lepers. Small shrines near leper colonies sometimes bore flowers, candles, or carved symbols left by the afflicted or their kin. In other regions, they wore hats or badges with a red cross that immediately identified them. In a world of uncertainty, of war and plague and sudden famine, the label of leper was at least definitive. No longer trade at market, no longer be held in a mother's arms, was a moment of profound breaking. Life would not continue as it had. Whatever came next would be different, smaller, quieter. A life lived on the other side of the road, behind the walls, beyond the bell. Some found solace in the structure of the leper colony, a new community, strict though it was, that offered routine and, in some cases, spiritual purpose. Others clung to hope that God might still see them, even if the world would not. It was not only to alert the healthy, it was a constant reminder to the leper themselves. They were not part of the world anymore. They were walking symbols of illness, of mortality, of divine mystery. If people referred to your past life, it was with unease. He used to be a blacksmith, or she once had a child. Pity mixed with revulsion. Some towns assigned small charitable donations to support their colonies. Others relied on occasional almsgiving. Lepers could beg indeed, were often required to, but only from a distance. They might be permitted to sit outside a church wall during Mass, never inside. Food was passed to them with long wooden spoons or through stone chutes. In some regions, lepers were allowed to keep animals, especially pigs, which they raised both for food and as a rare source of income. But the boundaries were strict. Too close, and the townspeople protested. Too far, and starvation came quietly. It was as though your former life had been erased, rewritten under the shadow of your disease. In such cases, the revelation was swift and merciless, and sent to live with adults far older than him, in buildings where coughing echoed off cold stone walls. A girl who had barely begun to learn her prayers might be deemed unfit for her village, bundled in cloth and carried away by a priest or a parent too grief-stricken to speak. For children, the fear was not only of the disease, but of what it made them become in the eyes of others untouchable, unlovable, forgotten. A nod to the bishop, a summons to the church, a public stripping of identity, and the ever-present bell or clapper that they were required to ring if anyone came too near. Travelers on the road would veer away from them, whispering prayers or crossing themselves. Children might run. Dogs barked. No one touched them. The air around them became a void. For many, it happened in early adulthood. Some were young mothers. Some were just apprenticed. Some had already buried other siblings from famine or plague. Leprosy came as one more blow. And now they would be sent down the road to a leprosarium, an isolated building or cluster of buildings on the edge of a village or far beyond it, where others like them waited. And there, in front of witnesses, their fate would be pronounced. They were to live apart. They were to wear special garments, often a gray or brown cloak with a hood, and carry a bell, a clapper, or a wooden rattle to announce their presence. They were to avoid touching others. They were forbidden from entering towns without permission. If they had property, it was often confiscated or turned over to the care of relatives. If they had family, they were instructed to part. A handful of earth might be sprinkled over them. This was not metaphorical. This was their social death. From that moment on, they would no longer be allowed to live within the community. No more market visits. No more church pews. No more shared meals. They were no longer sons, daughters, craftsmen, mothers. They were lepers. The Bible spoke of lepers as unclean, as people to be cast out and kept apart. Priests preached that the illness was a mirror of inner corruption, a visible sign of moral decay. Fear mingled with disgust, and compassion was drowned out by suspicion. Perhaps a stiffening in the joints that could be brushed off as age or hard labor. When someone suspected they might have leprosy, they were often brought before a cleric or even a bishop. These ecclesiastical officials, sometimes trained in rudimentary medical knowledge, sometimes not, would inspect the body for signs: skin discoloration, loss of sensation, deformities of the face, hands, and feet. The process was more ritual than diagnosis, a judgment as much as a medical assessment. In the early days, no one wanted to name it. People told themselves it was nothing: an insect bite, a winter chill, a scrape from working in the fields. But leprosy had a way of making itself known. Slowly, relentlessly, it stripped away denial. What started as a blemish became a diagnosis. And once the word was spoken, everything changed. In the medieval mind, leprosy was not just a disease, it was a divine judgment. The church, the healer of souls, became the arbiter of who was too diseased to remain in society. If confirmed, the verdict came swiftly. The afflicted person was declared dead to the world. The church required a ritual for this separation. This moment, this diagnosis, this ritual casting out, was one of the most devastating in a person's life. Even the journey to the leper colony was marked by separation. But before they could even begin the journey, many went through a period of hiding. Some fearing exile, tried to mask their symptoms. In wealthier towns, some lepers were given a small allowance or escorted to a monastery-run leper hospital. To be diagnosed with leprosy was to be transformed into something other. Your name remained, but it was spoken differently. Even children were not spared. A boy of 10 with the wrong lesions on his arm might be taken from his family. Socially, lepers were placed in an ambiguous space. They were outcasts, yet not criminals. The idea of being marked by the cross came in both symbolic and literal forms. Still, even within this grim reality, individual experiences varied. Not all who were diagnosed were immediately expelled, and for a few, the diagnosis brought unexpected clarity. But for most, the first diagnosis, the first moment of being called unclean, of being told they could no longer live with their family, and yet it was still life. Scarred, reduced, reshaped, but not extinguished. The hardest part was not the diagnosis. It wasn't the priest's words, the ritual of separation, or even the slow realization that life would never again be what it was. It was the leaving, the moment when a child reached for a mother's hand and was told not to touch. The leper would be brought forward before the priest and witnesses. A line was drawn, sometimes literally, between them and the rest of the community. In some cases, it was the family who walked them to the edge of the village or to the gates of the leper house. The road was usually quiet. Few words were exchanged. The silence between them throbbed louder than any sob. Sometimes a mother would press a small object into the leper's hand across. A sprig of lavender, a strip of cloth with a family scent still lingering on it. They had offered food to the leper house, perhaps even said prayers for its inhabitants. The other residents had all endured their own last embraces. Others were burned or read aloud only in private. Communication across that divide was difficult emotionally and practically. The outside world wanted to forget, and in time, many lepers stopped trying. They knew what it meant to carry the scent of your child's hair in your memory and know you would never breathe it again. They saw the signs in their bodies and knew what would come. Lepers spoke of it during long winter nights, whispered of it in prayer. It took on sacred weight. They tended to one another, created new rituals, found solace in shared sorrow. The last embrace was not the end of love. It was the beginning of a different kind of belonging, forged in grief, but bound by resilience. That moment, when their mother held their face and cried, or when their father turned away without a word, became a touchstone of identity. Before I left, they would say, before the gate, before the silence. It was the dividing line between two selves, the person they were and the one they became. Quietly, they gathered their things: bread, coins, the family relics. They kissed their sleeping children while they could still feel their lips. They lingered at the door, taking in the scent of wood smoke, the creak of the rafters, the warmth of belonging, and then walked away without waking anyone. These departures were perhaps the most heartbreaking of all. A self-imposed exile made to spare those they loved. They had felt the ache of a partner's voice, fading like smoke behind a closed door. The wounds of leprosy were physical, yes, but the deeper injuries were often invisible. Every new arrival brought with them a story of farewell, stitched together from broken moments, unspoken apologies, and love that had no place to go. It could not erase the feeling of arms wrapped around them in parting, the weight of a hand on their shoulder, the look in a parent's eyes that said, without words, "You are still mine. You always will be." Now, the gates would open for them. In some cases, they walked alone. In others, a son or daughter might escort them partway, though never past the boundary stones. A child grown to adulthood might return to kneel at the wall and pray with a parent on the other side. A mother might beg the church for mercy, asking to see her daughter one last time on her deathbed. And sometimes, incredibly, those requests were granted. Through grates or fences, across yards or chapel aisles, final words were spoken. And though no hands touched, the love reached across all the same. They parted on roadsides, with bowed heads and watery eyes, the leper turning to walk toward isolation, the child standing motionless, rooted in grief. During times of war or plague, the process was faster, more chaotic. Accusations flew. Diagnosis came quickly, sometimes wrongly. People vanished from their homes overnight. Rumors filled the gaps. She caught it at the well. He had it for years and hid it. They say her hands were already rotting. Fear made people cruel, and in those moments, last embraces were replaced by slamming doors and shouted warnings. The leper left not with blessing, but with curses chasing their heels. These tokens became lifelines in the days to come, worn thin by touch and prayer. They were reminders that once, the leper had been loved, had belonged somewhere. The leper would stand on one side, and the family on the other. Family members wondered, had they ignored the signs too long? Had they invited punishment by keeping the afflicted close? In small communities, reputation was currency. If a household produced a leper, neighbors began to whisper. Had the family sinned? Was it a punishment from God? Would it spread? Were there others hiding it? To shield themselves, families often distanced quickly. Some removed the leper's name from the hearth wall. Some changed their seating in church. Some denied the connection altogether. She was just a servant, they would say. He was a cousin, not blood. In doing so, they tried to protect what remained of their own place in the community, even if it meant abandoning the one who needed them most. Would God now judge them for showing too much mercy, or for showing too little? That confusion made partings jagged. Some families disowned the leper outright, forcing them out with angry words or public declarations. Others wept openly, promising to visit, to send food, to write if possible promises that were sometimes kept, often not. Final words could be spoken, though often they were choked by tears or swallowed in silence. No one dared cross the space in between. The leper might reach out one last time. Some parents let their fingers flutter near, aching to close the gap, but others held back, trembling, terrified of infection. They had been told to let go. That was what faith demanded. That was what the village expected. When a husband, worn from the fields, tried to hold his wife's face in trembling palms and was pulled back by her sobs. When a young woman, still in her first bloom, was told she could no longer kiss her siblings goodnight. It was the last embrace, or the absence of one, that carved itself into the memory deeper than any wound. In medieval society, the home was everything. It was the hearth, the identity, the inheritance. Generations lived under the same roof. The smells of stew and tallow, the scratch of wool and wood, the rhythm of bells and chores, all of it made up the heartbeat of a life. So when someone was declared a leper, and told they must leave that home forever, it was a form of death. A mother watching her son led away, her face twisted with grief, unable to run to him. A girl of 12 being told she could no longer sleep in the same room as her brothers, no longer comb her sister's hair, no longer rest her head in her grandmother's lap. Many cried, some screamed, some simply stood, too stunned to move. It wasn't always immediate. Sometimes the departure was delayed by a few hours, a single night, or until a carriage could be found. But always the end came. Bags were packed with shaking hands. Bread was wrapped in cloth and handed off like a holy object. Eyes met, lingered, then turned away. And finally, someone left. Not sudden and merciful, like a fever in the night, but slow, conscious, and cruel. One had to walk away from everything they had built, touched, and loved, and be watched as they did so. Sometimes the farewell took place in the village square. For children, the separation was often the most brutal. Not all lepers were escorted from home by strangers. But even these moments of tenderness were often laced with guilt. The shame, too, was thick. For those diagnosed later in life older parents, village elders, the departure took on a different shape. They had watched others leave before. Inside the leper colony, newcomers were received with quiet understanding. Some lepers tried to write to their families. Letters were rare, often passed through clergy or charitable intermediaries. Many went unanswered, but there were exceptions. Some families defied the fear. A brother might visit from a distance, leaving parcels of food or tools just inside the gates. Not everyone left behind had the luxury of ceremony. And then there were the lepers who chose to leave before being told. As the years passed, the memory of that last embrace became both balm and torment. And yet, even after such a loss, something within them reached toward hope. They planted gardens, they sang hymns, they carved initials into chapel wood, because for all that leprosy took from them, their homes, their names, their place in the world, it could not take memory. The road was never short. Whether the leper house stood just outside the village walls or miles beyond the last farmhouse, the journey to reach it stretched endlessly in the mind. It was not measured by distance alone, but by what was left behind with every step. The walk itself became a kind of ritual, unwanted, unspoken, a passage from life into a half-death that few ever truly returned from. The leper did not walk this road like other travelers. They did not ride in carriages. No friendly strangers greeted them with nods or smiles. No one offered them bread or asked about their journey. Others walked barefaced, hollowed by sorrow, their expressions hard and unreadable. A few carried small bundles, simple things, bread wrapped in cloth, a wooden spoon, a prayer token, a stitched pouch of herbs meant to soothe the sores or sweeten the air, a solitary figure walking slowly, a priest perhaps behind or ahead, murmuring prayers. But no amount of silk could shield the heart from breaking. Every step recalled a moment before exile, the feel of a loved one's hand, the taste of stew by the hearth, the way laughter once bubbled from the chest without shame. Now, the only sounds were the bell and the breath. Some wept as they walked. Others clenched their jaws, determined to hold dignity like a shield. A few sang hymns under their breath, not out of joy, but as armor clinging to the last scraps of their place in God's order. Reactions varied. Some veered away, muttering curses. Others threw coins from a distance or dropped bread without meeting eyes. A few paused, struck by pity, and offered blessings. Sometimes they were nothing more than a worn arch, a crumbling stone wall, or a heavy wooden door with a simple cross carved above it. Often the air smelled of herbs, sage, rosemary, or lavender, planted to cover the scent of sickness. The sounds were soft. The cough of another resident, the scratch of a rake in the garden, the distant toll of a chapel bell. They simply opened the gate and looked with eyes that had seen many such arrivals. Their name, in some places, was recorded in the chapel registry. They were prayed over, not cursed, but named. For leprosy could not take everything. And in this place, among others who knew what exile meant, they were no longer an outcast. They were one of many. Eyes that remembered their own road. The newcomer was led in gently, sometimes given water. The sound of the bell, the silence of turned faces, the emptiness of goodbye. Some sat alone in the gardens, eyes closed, breathing in the wild air. They tended to each other's wounds. They shared stories. They learned which voices to trust. Some found peace in the chapel's hush, others in the soft rasp of broom on stone. The road that led them here, harsh as it was, had not emptied them entirely. Others wept through the night, curled beneath blankets. A few wrote names into the wood of their doorframes, or whispered prayers for the ones they left behind. But in walking it, the leper passed not just into isolation, but into community. Not chosen, perhaps, not ideal, but real. And in that reality, a quiet kind of life waited, not whole, not healed, but still, undeniably, life. The road stayed with them, even as the path forward unfolded. Shown to a small cell or room with straw bedding, a shelf for tokens, a bowl for broth. They were offered simple cloth, herbs to bathe their wounds, and quiet instructions whispered in low tones. Birds nested in the rafters, cats curled in warm corners. Life continued here, but a different kind. God go with you, they whispered, as though the road ahead led not just to isolation, but to the edge of the world. They stared at the gate not as a beginning, but as a final point of return. Beyond it lay the reality of leper life. Wounds that would not heal, voices that barely spoke, and faces that had forgotten what joy looked like. Behind them lay the world that had cast them out. And in that moment, many hesitated not from fear, but from the full weight of knowing. Nobility was no defense. One with its own rules, rhythms, and silences. And as the leper neared its entrance, time itself seemed to slow. Medieval society believed in physical and spiritual separation. Paths to leprosaria were carved away from main roads, winding through fields, along ridgelines, or beside streams. Friends or family, despite the danger, walked a few steps behind or ahead. Some offered words of comfort, though they dared not touch. In rare cases, a priest or friar volunteered to accompany the leper all the way to the colony's gates. They carried psalters, sang psalms, and anointed the traveler with holy oils before departure. These acts of kindness were treasured moments when humanity, however fleeting, defied fear. Some crossed old bridges or passed ruined chapels. Few came near the places where people still lived in health. The land itself seemed to change, more wild, more silent. The birds called, but no one answered. The wind shifted through trees, but no one paused to admire them. The journey became a meditation on loss. A knight's son, a merchant's wife, a scholar's daughter all ended up on the same road, headed to the same fate. The leper house did not ask for titles. It did not care about lineage. It opened its gates for any marked by the disease, and the road to those gates was the great equalizer. Children watched from behind carts. Elders sat in stillness, blinking as if unable to believe what they saw. Shopkeepers turned their backs. Dogs barked and were silenced. The bells clinked. The wind carried them forward. No farewells followed, only the sound of retreating footsteps. Most carried almost nothing. Their possessions had been left behind, burned, or passed to relatives. What they now had was a life stripped to its barest shape. A bell, a wooden clapper, or a hollow rattle tied to their wrist. Each step was announced by sound. The ringing or clicking was a warning. Unclean. Stay away. It echoed off the stones of narrow lanes, rustled the dry air of footpaths, and filled the ears of passers-by with a haunting rhythm. Others unfolded in the heat of high summer, flies buzzing, sweat trickling over ruined skin. Winter made everything harder chilled breath, frozen fingers, and aching limbs. But regardless of season, the leper house awaited. The destination was fixed. What varied was the world's reaction as they passed through it. Those bells, meant to prevent the spread of disease, became instruments of shame. Instead, they moved through a world that recoiled at their presence. Heads turned, doors closed. Mothers pulled children behind skirts. Some crossed themselves. Others hurled insults under their breath. Even in silence, the judgment was deafening. In most places, lepers were required to carry signs of their condition, and yet the lepers still walked. Some wore hoods to hide their faces, trying to shield their swollen features from familiar eyes. The weather did not pause for sorrow. Some journeys began under gray clouds, the sky weeping alongside them. In villages, the procession often resembled a funeral without the coffin. Those from wealthier families sometimes rode on donkeys or small carts, their faces veiled, their passage arranged quietly. Along the way, memories became burdens. The route to the leper colony was often intentionally isolated. There were those who refused to walk the road alone, but more often, the leper walked alone. At times, other travelers stumbled upon them, farmhands, pilgrims, soldiers. Indeed, for many, the journey felt like stepping off the known map. The colony was not merely a place, it was a new existence entirely. The gates were rarely grand. At the threshold, many paused. They knocked, or rang the entry bell, or simply waited. Someone came, always. A fellow leper, a caretaker, a monk. They did not speak at first. Their old clothes, if not already burned, were taken. For days after, the echoes of the journey remained. But even exile is not the end. Within weeks, they learned the rhythms of the colony, the mealtimes, the prayers, the labor. The road to exile was long, unforgiving. It marked the soul as much as it did the body. The first steps through the gates of a leper colony were not like entering a village or home. They were not like arriving at a monastery or hospital or poorhouse. The leprosarium, sometimes called the leper house, was a collection of low stone buildings with small windows and shuttered doors. Often there was a central chapel, modest in size but carefully tended. Some colonies had gardens, patches of lavender, and sage growing wild. Others had only hard-packed dirt and muddy paths. Everywhere there was the smell of old air, dried herbs, and something faintly metallic, the scent of illness and age. They would not speak loudly. Their voice would be soft, weathered, almost gentle. They might ask the newcomer's name, or where they came from. Or they might say nothing at all, and simply nod, motioning toward a room, a bench, a basin of water set aside for washing. A basin sometimes of wood, sometimes stone-filled with water, steeped in rosemary or marigold. The newcomer was invited to wash, not just for hygiene, though that mattered, but as a symbol, a final gesture of leaving behind the world outside, hands dipped into the cold, a cloth drawn gently over arms, over face, over the sores that marked their exclusion. It did not heal, but it offered a beginning, a moment of touch without recoil. They were not greeted with smiles or open arms or the warmth of a fire-lit hall. No one called out their name. Instead, the sounds here were hushed. A cough in the distance, the creak of a chapel door, the soft scraping of a broom along stone. Even the animals' stray cats, dogs, the occasional chicken moved as if they, too, understood the solemnity of the place. No one rushed forward to take their cloak or ask about their journey. Simple, coarse, usually in muted tones, brown, ash-gray, sometimes a dusty green. Faces that had collapsed in places. Fingers twisted into claws. Feet wrapped in cloth. Eyes dulled by pain or softened by kindness. These were the companions of this new life. The weight of everything that had happened, pressed down on the chest like a stone. They were given time to adjust, to learn the layout, to understand the rhythms. A shared prayer. A hand held during moments of pain. Some found love even here. Not in the way of fairy tales, but in the quiet comfort of presence. Two souls who had lost everything else, choosing to walk the remaining road together. It was not celebrated loudly, but understood. The leper colony, though a place of suffering, was also a place of deep humanity. Mass was held, prayers were whispered, candles lit for the dead. The altar was plain. The air smelled of wax and stone. It was to learn that silence could hold meaning, that pain could forge kindness, that exile could still contain beauty. The gates behind them did not close loudly. They did not need to. The world they had left was already distant, unreachable. But within these walls, within the strange quiet of this unwanted place, something else took root. But in that space, the residents found a kind of sacredness the outside world had denied them. They were still children of God, still souls worth saving. And in the hymns sung softly each morning, There was a kind of healing that went deeper than the skin. But eventually, they would find their place. Some helped in the gardens. Others tended the sick. Some carved wood, sewed cloth, or prepared simple meals. They refused to speak, refused to work, sat alone and cursed the world. Others tried to dominate, bringing old habits of hierarchy into a place that had no room for pride. Fights broke out, sometimes. Words were exchanged. But in time, most learned. The colony was its own kind of family, a broken one, a grieving one, but bound by necessity and pain. Contribution was not just survival, it was dignity. In a world that had declared them useless, the leper house allowed them to matter again, however quietly. Dreams came of home, of family, of the last embrace on the road. Some cried quietly. Others stared at the ceiling until morning. The routine of the colony began early prayers at dawn, a light meal of broth or bread, then chores or rest depending on ability. Not fellow villagers, not kin, but strangers bound by exile. And yet they understood things no one else could. They knew what it meant to hear the bell toll for you, to walk the road alone, to be declared untouchable and survive it. They were designed to be functional and indistinct. No personal embroidery, no bright color. The idea was uniformity, humility, invisibility. To wear the colony's cloak was to shed whatever status or individuality you had once held. A merchant and a beggar, once clothed worlds apart, now wore the same shroud. You were no longer your trade or your birth. You were a resident, now a soul among many, no better, no worse. Instead, there was silence thick, steady, almost reverent. Do not expect visits. Do not look longingly through the gates. Hope could be dangerous. Some held on to it too tightly and were broken when it never bore fruit. Others let it go completely and lost themselves in despair. The wise ones found a balance. They remembered without clinging. They mourned without crumbling. They dreamed quietly in corners where no one could see. In poorer places, they might sleep in shared halls, with beds lined wall to wall and curtains drawn between them. There were colonies run by monastic orders, where nuns or monks tended to the sick and offered prayers at dusk. Others were almost entirely self-governed residents, living among residents, forming routines, carving rules out of necessity. A silence not of peace, but of long sorrow. It was the hush of a place where hope did not come easily, and joy was something remembered more than felt. For the one arriving skin-marked, soul-bruised, and body-tired, it was like stepping into a memory they hadn't known they carried. The gates themselves were simple. A wooden arch, a rusted latch, perhaps a small iron bell hung by a cord or a carved cross above the entrance, warning visitors that this place was not part of the world they had known. Because in truth, no one came to a leper colony by choice. Those who reached its doors had already been pushed from every other. They were the ones whose families could no longer risk closeness, whose villages had turned their backs, whose physicians had stopped pretending to offer cures. The gate was open not because the colony welcomed freely, but because the world had offered no other place to go. Some leper houses were enclosed by walls. Others stood open on the edge of the forest or fields. There were no guards, no soldiers, only space and a deep quiet. When new arrivals came, and they came often, they were not stopped. There was no resistance to their entrance, no gatekeeper barring the way. The first person they met inside was often another leper, an elder resident, marked by time and illness, perhaps with a twisted hand or missing digits, cloaked in brown or gray. The water was always there. The ritual of cleansing was one of the first gestures in the colony. After the washing came the changing. Each leper house had its own garments. Rooms varied. In some wealthier leprosaria, a newcomer might be given a small cell with a straw mattress, a shelf, and a window slit facing east. But whatever the structure, the feeling was the same, the strange quiet. The slow movements, the absence of children's laughter or merchants shouting or bells from village squares. For the newcomer, it was disorienting. Not just the surroundings, but the people. To see others, many others, bearing the same signs of the disease. The first night was often the hardest. Many could not sleep. The straw itched. The air was unfamiliar. Newcomers were not expected to work right away, but there were unspoken rules. Do not ask about the outside world too often. Among the residents, there were friendships. Slowly built, gently tended. A nod at meals. There were also tensions. Not everyone adapted easily. Some arrived angry at God, at family, at fate. The chapel stood at the center. Not always physically, but symbolically. It was where the residents gathered, even those who could no longer kneel or walk. To enter the leper colony was to lose everything and begin again. Not in the way of rebirth, but in the slow, painful reshaping of what life could be. It was not joy. Not yet. But it was something. A soft voice saying, "You are not alone." And in time, that was enough. Life within the leper colony did not unfold with chatter or laughter or the casual murmur of human closeness. It moved instead in long measured silences, punctuated only by ritual, by prayer, and by the necessary language of care. Words were used sparingly, like precious coin. Voices were low, movement deliberate, touch nearly forbidden. But a sign of spiritual uncleanliness, perhaps punishment for sin, perhaps a trial sent by God. Speech, in this view, was a privilege for the pure. A leper was to accept suffering in silence, offer it up in prayer, and refrain from the idle noise of earthly life. Words could tempt pride, could stir rebellion, could lead the afflicted to forget their place in the hierarchy of penitence. Bread and broth were ladled out in silence. Some said grace with bowed heads. Others stared blankly at their bowls. There were no clinks of cutlery. Most ate with fingers or wooden spoons. Conversation was discouraged. If a resident tried to speak, especially if they were new, they were gently shushed. A hand raised, a finger to the lips, a shake of the head. In time, the silence became routine. Words dried up, questions faded, only necessity remained. But even this was done with rituals of protection. Gloves, prayer, the use of cloth as barrier. The residents themselves rarely touched one another unless absolutely necessary. A hand on a shoulder might be the most one received. A brief gesture of solidarity risky, powerful, unforgettable. A raised brow, a tilted head, the way someone held their bowl. Each was a sentence in a language of subtlety. They learned each other's habits, moods, needs, and sorrows, without saying a thing. A shared look before morning prayers. There was a solemn grace to the way people moved, as if life itself had slowed to its truest rhythm. The outside world was noisy, cluttered, competitive. Here, everything was pared down to what mattered most: presence, endurance, patience. A fever, a fall, a wound reopened. These things passed unmentioned if the person could not raise their voice. Those who lost the ability to speak through illness, or age, or despair, became doubly cut off. There were stories of residents dying alone in their cells, their final hours marked by whispers that no one heard. The silence, meant to protect, also allowed people to disappear. They spoke too loudly at meals. They asked questions in the chapel. Some wept openly and begged to be comforted. But the community would gently, firmly return them to silence. Not with cruelty, but with sadness. "This is how we survive," their eyes seemed to say. "This is what the world has made us." It became less a rule and more a part of who they were. Speech felt strange, like a forgotten muscle. Many residents, if ever released or moved to a hospital, struggled to speak again. Their voices cracked. Their thoughts felt slow to shape. Some never returned to fluent conversation. The silence had rewritten them. In some colonies, the silence was even considered sacred, a discipline like fasting, a kind of monastic vow, to speak only in prayer, to listen more than speak, to reflect more than react. These acts were tiny, invisible rebellions, attempts to reclaim something lost. And though dangerous, they were cherished. The silence was a rule, yes, but it was not a choice. When someone broke it, even briefly, it reminded the others that they were still human, still longing, still capable of sound. A nod when passing in the corridor, a gesture to offer the last crust of bread. These were the colony's version of conversation. This was not a silence born of peace, but one dictated by fear, reverence, and centuries of belief that too much contact, too much humanness, invited both danger and divine disapproval. It was shaped by centuries of fear and theology. It denied much, but it also gave structure. It was the border between life as it had been and life as it now was. And though it hurt, though it muffled laughter and drowned out joy, it also protected. It allowed the residents to exist without constant fear of reprisal. It kept the fragile peace. If someone needed help, bandages, ointment, aid in standing, they might gesture before speaking. If speech was used, it was short. Please, here, help. In silence, they shared grief. They mourned the dead together. They waited out fevers. They watched seasons change. A bird nesting on the chapel roof, the first frost on the garden wall, the crackle of fire in winter. These things became their language, a way to say, I see this too. I am here with you. Someone might chuckle at a joke whispered behind the garden wall, but they would stop themselves, looking around nervously. They would remember the rule. Joy was suspicious. Too loud, too alive. Better to stay quiet. Better to remain unseen. And so, even the small pleasures, songs, stories, the rhythm of a voice, reading aloud, were lost to the hush. Whispered, never shouted. There was no laughter, no storytelling, no debates. Not because the residents lacked thoughts, but because they had been taught through doctrine, fear, and habit that silence was safety, and safety was survival. The rule of silence was not always written in law, but it was lived. It governed every gesture, shaped every day, and settled into the bones of those who called the colony home. The danger of contact had been drilled into them, through sermons, through superstition, through bitter experience. A child who once clung to their mother's hand now flinched at another's approach. A husband who had kissed his wife goodbye now dared not brush shoulders with a stranger. They learned to live beside others without reaching for them. It was a strange kind of loneliness, surrounded yet isolated. Feet shuffled. Wooden clappers tapped softly as some walked. A few helped others hobble forward, but there was no conversation along the path. No greetings. No shared complaints about the cold or the rain. In those formative years, when affection should have flowed freely, they learned instead to withdraw. They watched their elders move without embrace. They heard voices only in sacred spaces. Their worlds shrank to the sound of bells, of footsteps, of rustling robes. Some tried to speak at first. They asked questions. They cried. But over time, they learned what was allowed, what was safe. They learned to fall silent like the rest. They moved like shadows under the early light, wrapped in coarse robes, their faces lowered. In the chapel, voices rose only in chant monotone, solemn, ancient. No personal prayers were said aloud. Only the collective offering of suffering, carried by the choir of broken bodies. From the moment a leper crossed the threshold, the message was clear. Speak less, touch not, be still. To speak too close, to exhale over bread, to cough without turning, these things were believed to spread corruption. Better, then, to remain quiet. To limit sound and contact alike, the leper's breath was a risk. Their words, no matter how kind or desperate, were threats to the living. The restrictions had roots in both religion and medicine. In the eyes of the Church, leprosy was not merely a disease of the flesh in medieval medical thinking. Speech, particularly breath, was feared as a vector of contagion. And so silence became the way of life. In the mornings, when the bell rang for prayers, residents filed quietly to the chapel. Meals were no different. Long wooden tables lined the dining hall. Each resident had their place. Even necessary speech followed rules. Touch was even more restricted. It was not outlawed outright, but it was rare. Monks or nuns, if present, might offer touch in the course of care-wrapping wounds, applying salves. Children who had grown up within the colony, or who had arrived young, suffered the most. This silence created a world within a world. Residents developed ways to communicate that did not involve words or contact. They used their eyes. A glance across a room could speak volumes. It was not without its beauty. In that silence, there was dignity. No one shouted, no one argued. But silence could also be cruel. It concealed suffering. Residents in pain sometimes went unnoticed for hours. It also stifled joy. Laughter, when it came, felt dangerous. A slip of memory, a flash of what life had once been. Some tried to challenge it. A few new arrivals, angry at the isolation, tried to start conversations. Others resisted in subtler ways. A whispered greeting in the garden. A poem scratched into the underside of a bench. A song hummed beneath a breath while sweeping. Over time, even the rebels fell quiet. Not because they gave in, but because silence itself changed them. And yet, in the stillness, there was a form of connection. Because they all understood it. The rule was not questioned. It was lived. The silence of the leper colony was not natural. They prayed in silence. They grieved in silence. They grew old in silence. But in the eyes of those who shared it, everything was understood. The body did not heal in the leper colony. It endured. It lingered. It unraveled slowly across the seasons, marked not by recovery, but by a long procession of symptoms that shifted and returned, never quite the same, never fully absent. The body became something both deeply familiar and strangely foreign, an enemy to be managed, a vessel to be carried, a thing no longer trusted. For many residents, the bed was both refuge and prison. It was where they began their mornings, where they returned in pain, and where, for some, they would remain until the end. The beds were simple frames of wood, ropes slung across for support, topped with thin mattresses stuffed with straw or wool, the latter a luxury. Sheets were scarce and rarely clean. Blankets, when they existed, were rough and warm. These sores opened deep into the flesh, raw and vulnerable to infection. They were painful, but worse, they were slow to heal if they healed at all. Flies were drawn to them in warm months. In winter, the cold stiffened the limbs and worsened circulation. Some residents developed gangrene. Others lost entire limbs over time, first fingers, then hands, then entire arms. The colony bore witness to this with a kind of quiet dread. Everyone knew it could be them next. But few looked long. Those who did often wept. They remembered faces they no longer had. They remembered how others once looked at them with love or pride or desire. Now they saw only fear in others' eyes, or pity, or, worst of all, blank indifference. It made it harder to see. But inside the broken bodies were still minds, still souls, still flashes of humor and tenderness. The winter months were hardest. Cold air stiffened joints. Wounds healed slower. Firewood was rationed. Blankets were thin. Many stayed in bed all day, wrapped in what warmth they could find, dozing between waking dreams. Some whispered prayers. Others simply waited. The burial was simple, a grave in the colony's small plot, marked by wood or stone, sometimes only initials. A psalm was read, a prayer offered. Residents stood in silence, each one imagining their own day to come. Those who remained climbed back into their beds, curled under their blankets, and carried their own wounded bodies through another day. A resident might wheeze and cough and groan through the night, but by morning they were at the garden again, bent over rosemary with trembling hands. They found ways to live around it, a flower blooming by the chapel door, a loaf of bread rising perfectly, the warmth of sun through a cracked window. It was also a place of dreams, of whispered songs, of stories told from memory when sleep would not come. In the silence of the night, in rooms filled with breath and rustling cloth, there were moments of peace. The smell of ointments, the slow procession of pain, it all became part of life, part of what it meant to live in a body that no longer obeyed, but had not yet given up. Moments when pain eased, just enough to let the soul breathe. These moments mattered. They reminded the residents that they were more than the sum of their wounds, that the body, broken as it was, still carried the heart. Another might cry silently in pain and offer their last spoonful of stew to a neighbor. They did not see themselves as noble. They simply knew that the body, while betraying them, was all they had left, and it still had work to do. For those with severe lesions or open ulcers, the fabric often stuck to flesh in the night, only to be painfully peeled away in the morning. Cloth had to be boiled when it could be, though firewood was limited. How to write with crooked hands? They adapted. They endured. They fashioned new tools, walking sticks, braces, slings. Some carved their own crutches. Others learned to sew with their left hands after the right gave out. They taught each other. They shared tricks, advice, small victories. A new way to fold a bandage. A better way to clean a wound. These things passed among them like treasure. Caregivers soaked strips in herbal washes, then wrapped wounds with practiced hands. They worked quickly but gently. They had all seen pain, and many had felt it themselves. There was no flinching, no disgust. Only the calm of those who knew that this was the work of life here, keeping the body going day after day for as long as it could last. It arrived like a patient visitor sitting by the bedside for days or weeks, watching. The resident would grow thinner. The sores would deepen. Breathing became labored. The body quieted cell by cell. When death came, it was rarely dramatic. Sometimes they passed in the night, sometimes at dawn, with the chapel bell tolling softly in the distance. A caregiver would come in, check for breath, whisper a prayer, and cover the face. The bed, though necessary, was never comfortable. Leprosy attacked the body in many ways, but most cruel was its ability to dull the senses. Residents bathed as best they could, some with help, others alone, sitting in shallow tubs and pouring water over themselves with clay jugs. Leprosy attacked cartilage, and the nose was often the first to go. It flattened, eroded by time. The upper lip followed. Some lost their teeth. Their eyes grew red and dry, often blinking slowly, not from sadness alone, but from the damage done to their tear ducts and lids. Facial hair fell out. Eyebrows vanished. The result was a face both ghostly and mask-like, difficult to read, difficult to recognize, even to oneself. Soap was a precious thing, often homemade from lye and animal fat. Those who could not reach certain places, feet, backs, shoulders, depended on others. Modesty gave way to necessity. They washed each other not with judgment, but with care. It was a form of service, of compassion, that spoke more than words. The disease deadened nerves, especially in the hands, feet, and face. Cloth soaked with herbs or old salves fell away, revealing skin that was cracked, flaked, sometimes weeping. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptics, no true pain relief. Caregivers, whether monks, nuns, or residents themselves, used what they had: wine, vinegar, crushed herbs, honey, clay, oils. Some believed certain mixtures could draw out the illness. Poultices of garlic or onion were common. Foul-smelling ointments were applied in hope of purging bad humors. Leeches were used by some, though sparingly, and with fear. Surgery was rare, but amputations happened, sometimes in desperation, sometimes as mercy. They checked for new sores, for swelling, for the ominous redness that hinted at deeper infection. If they could feel heat, they checked for fever. But often, they could not. A person might burn themselves without feeling it, might cut or bruise without noticing. Over time, wounds became ulcers. Ulcers became infections, and infections became permanent damage. Fingers curled into claws. Toes blackened and dropped off. Noses collapsed. Eyes grew clouded and dry. The body reshaped itself under the quiet tyranny of decay. The residents learned to inspect their bodies constantly. Each morning, they would sit up slowly, many with help, and unwrap the bandages wound around their limbs. Medical care in the leprosarium was rudimentary, shaped by the limits of medieval knowledge. One of the most common afflictions was the bedsore. Residents who could no longer walk or sit upright developed pressure ulcers on their hips, shoulders, and backs. Bandaging was a daily ritual. Bathing was difficult. Most colonies had a shared washhouse or a small bath chamber. The water was rarely warm. The face for many was the site of the cruelest transformations. Mirrors were rare. Most colonies had none. A basin of water might give a glimpse. And yet, even in these broken bodies, there was strength. Residents learned how to walk with wrapped feet, how to grip spoons with 3 fingers. Illness did not erase identity. It changed it. Pain was constant, some days more than others. Joint pain, eye pain, toothaches, swollen glands. Fevers came and went. Colds turned into infections. Death was familiar. It came often, but never suddenly. The body, even then, was treated with respect. It was washed as gently as possible, wrapped in cloth, and still life went on. Beds were cleaned, bandages boiled, meals prepared. The body of the living demanded attention, always. One death could not halt the needs of dozens. It was not noble. It was not tragic. It was simply what was. They lived with pain, slept with it, ate with it. It sat beside them like a constant companion. But they did not surrender to it entirely. The bed was not only a place of illness. And so they endured. The sores, the stiffness, the missing limbs. They were not just suffering. They were still alive. Before the sun rose fully above the jagged rooftops and smoke-streaked chimneys of the outside world, the alms line had already begun to form. Hunched figures, wrapped in layers of tattered cloth, stood quietly beside the gates of the leper colony. Their bodies were still, but their eyes watched the horizon. Some held wooden bowls or cups carved by their own hands. Others carried baskets or small cloth sacks. No one spoke. The line was not just a line. It was a ritual and act of survival cloaked in humility, performed day after day, regardless of weather or mood or dignity. In the early years of a resident's life inside the leper colony, stepping into that line for the first time was one of the most difficult acts they would face. Not because it required effort, but because it required surrender. It meant admitting dependence. It meant offering oneself to the mercy of others, to strangers outside the gates who might sneer or pity or look away. The sick were not allowed to cross into town. The line was as close as they could get to the lives they once lived. Beyond the threshold, they became shadows of what they had been, no longer farmers or mothers or craftsmen, but lepers begging for sustenance. The gates were always locked. A small hatch or grill was opened each morning by a caretaker or one of the colony's healthier residents. They placed a sign nearby, sometimes a bell or a wooden plank with painted letters reminding passers-by of the leper's needs. Some colonies posted a psalm or a prayer alongside it, hoping scripture might soften the hearts of those who walked past. Blessed are the merciful, it might say. Or, what you do for the least of these, you do for me. But not everyone read, and fewer still stopped. The line was often longest on holy days. Feast days, saints' days, the Sabbath, these were when townspeople were most likely to give. Not from affection, but from duty. Almsgiving was one of the 7 corporal acts of mercy, and giving to lepers was seen as especially virtuous. It was believed that helping the sick, especially those deemed cursed, could bring the giver closer to salvation. So on Sundays, churchgoers sometimes arrived with small bundles, crusts of bread, bruised apples, leftover stew sealed in clay pots. Children, taught to avert their gaze from the sick, sometimes snuck sweets through the gate when their parents weren't looking. But the rest of the week, the line could wait for hours and go home with nothing. Some days, the townspeople hurried past. They didn't want to look at the twisted hands, the disfigured faces, the sores wrapped in dirty cloth. They crossed to the other side of the road. Others came too close not to give, but to mock. Children dared one another to toss stones near the gate. A drunk might stumble up and laugh, shouting crude jokes or spitting into the dirt. The sick said nothing. They stood. They waited. They hoped. Sometimes they sang. Not loudly, never loudly, but in soft murmurs, as if to soothe their own pride. They chanted hymns or old folk songs. They whispered prayers into the cold air, voices trembling as much from emotion as from illness. Singing was not for the people outside. It was for the line itself, for those who stood in it. It was a reminder that they were still human, that they still had breath, that their voices hadn't yet been taken by the disease. The bowls were simple. Most were carved by hand from scraps of wood. Some were adorned with etched symbols, crosses, initials, a sun, a bird. Others were cracked and worn smooth from years of use. A few used tin cups or chipped clay vessels. When a coin landed inside, it made a sharp sound that echoed briefly in the stillness. When a piece of bread landed, it thudded softly. These sounds mattered. They were the music of hope. But hope did not fill bellies. What was given had to be shared. Once the alms line returned to the colony, the food and coins were collected, counted, and divided. The strongest residents, or those tasked with caregiving, handled the portions. They tried to be fair, though there were always whispers of favoritism. The bread was sliced thin. The coins saved for firewood, medicine, or mending. Sometimes the day's yield was enough for a small meal for all. Sometimes it wasn't. And on the worst days, when no one came, or when the line was turned away, the hunger was sharp and unforgiving. No one starved outright, not immediately. The colony had stores of grain, occasional deliveries from distant monasteries, small gardens inside the walls. But these were not enough. Not always. The line existed to fill the gap between survival and malnutrition, to fill the bellies of those too sick to tend crops, too weak to boil water, too far gone to chew. And when the line failed, those people suffered first. There was pride in the line, a strange, quiet pride. The residents dressed themselves before stepping out, pulling on their least torn robes, wrapping their wounds, brushing their hair if they still had it. They did not go to beg looking like corpses. They went looking like people. Scarred, yes. Bent, yes. But still people. For those who could no longer work or cook or clean, standing in that line was their contribution to the community. They endured the stares, the insults, the indifference, so that others inside might eat. The young ones learned early. If a child inside the colony was old enough to stand, old enough to walk a few steps, they stood in the line, sometimes with their parents, sometimes alone. They clutched their own bowls. They watched the road with large, solemn eyes. And when a kind soul dropped something into their hands, they smiled with all the light left in them. The alms line hardened them quickly, but it also gave them purpose. It showed them they still mattered. And sometimes kindness did come. There were townspeople who gave regularly not for salvation, but out of real compassion. A baker who left loaves near the gate. A widow who brought broth each Tuesday. A nun who pressed rosemary sprigs into the hands of the sick, whispering for courage. These gestures, small as they were, filled more than stomachs. They filled hearts. They reminded the lepers that they had not been fully forgotten. Some of the colony's elders remembered a time before they needed the line. They spoke of full tables, of fat geese at Christmas time, of fresh milk and warm bread. They had fed others once. They had passed coins to beggars, not imagining they would one day need the same. The reversal stung. Some wept in secret after alms were gathered. Others laughed bitterly, their eyes far away. Life, they said, was a wheel, and no one knew where they might be when it turned. The line was also dangerous. During outbreaks of plague or unrest, the colony became even more feared. Gates were barred tighter. Guards refused to allow the sick near. The line was banned. Residents who dared approach the boundary were chased away with sticks or worse. Hunger grew fierce in those weeks. Some whispered of stealing into town at night. Most were too ill to try. A few vanished trying anyway. And yet, day after day, they returned. The line reformed. The bowls were held out. The eyes searched the horizon. It was not only food they waited for. It was recognition. It was a sign that they still existed, that they had not been erased from the world completely. A crust of bread said, "I see you." A coin said, "You matter still." For those in the line, the shame faded over time. It was replaced by resolve. They held out their bowls not with begging hands, but with steady ones. They had no illusions. They knew what they were in the highs of the world, but they also knew they were more. That beneath the scars and silence, they carried souls full of longing and light. That the act of standing there each morning, waiting, hoping, enduring, was itself an act of courage. And so the line stretched on, through fog and rain, through snow and heat, through grief and sickness. It became a thread of connection between the colony and the world outside, a bridge of humility and necessity, a prayer, whispered without words, that anyone might answer. The bowls waited, the faces watched, and still they stood. Before the sun rose fully above the jagged rooftops and smoke-streaked chimneys of the outside world, the alms line had already begun to form. Hunched figures, wrapped in layers of tattered cloth, stood quietly beside the gates of the leper colony. Their bodies were still, but their eyes watched the horizon. Some held wooden bowls or cups carved by their own hands. Others carried baskets or small cloth sacks. No one spoke. The line was not just a line. It was a ritual and act of survival cloaked in humility, performed day after day, regardless of weather or mood or dignity. In the early years of a resident's life inside the leper colony, stepping into that line for the first time was one of the most difficult acts they would face. Not because it required effort, but because it required surrender. It meant admitting dependence. It meant offering oneself to the mercy of others, to strangers outside the gates who might sneer or pity or look away. The sick were not allowed to cross into town. The line was as close as they could get to the lives they once lived. Beyond the threshold, they became shadows of what they had been, no longer farmers or mothers or craftsmen, but lepers begging for sustenance. The gates were always locked. A small hatch or grill was opened each morning by a caretaker or one of the colony's healthier residents. They placed a sign nearby, sometimes a bell or a wooden plank with painted letters reminding passers-by of the leper's needs. Some colonies posted a psalm or a prayer alongside it, hoping scripture might soften the hearts of those who walked past. "Blessed are the merciful," it might say, or "What you do for the least of these, you do for me." But not everyone read, and fewer still stopped. The line was often longest on holy days. Feast days, saints' days, the Sabbath, these were when townspeople were most likely to give. Not from affection, but from duty. Almsgiving was one of the 7 corporal acts of mercy, and giving to lepers was seen as especially virtuous. It was believed that helping the sick, especially those deemed cursed, could bring the giver closer to salvation. So on Sundays, churchgoers sometimes arrived with small bundles, crusts of bread, bruised apples, leftover stew sealed in clay pots. Children, taught to avert their gaze from the sick, sometimes snuck sweets through the gate when their parents weren't looking. But the rest of the week, the line could wait for hours and go home with nothing. Some days, the townspeople hurried past. They didn't want to look at the twisted hands, the disfigured faces, the sores wrapped in dirty cloth. They crossed to the other side of the road. Others came too close not to give, but to mock. Children dared one another to toss stones near the gate. A drunk might stumble up and laugh, shouting crude jokes or spitting into the dirt. The sick said nothing. They stood. They waited. They hoped. Sometimes they sang. Not loudly, never loudly, but in soft murmurs, as if to soothe their own pride. They chanted hymns or old folk songs. They whispered prayers into the cold air, voices trembling as much from emotion as from illness. Singing was not for the people outside. It was for the line itself, for those who stood in it. It was a reminder that they were still human, that they still had breath, that their voices hadn't yet been taken by the disease. The bowls were simple. Most were carved by hand from scraps of wood. Some were adorned with etched symbols, crosses, initials, a sun, a bird. Others were cracked and worn smooth from years of use. A few used tin cups or chipped clay vessels. When a coin landed inside, it made a sharp sound that echoed briefly in the stillness. When a piece of bread landed, it thudded softly. These sounds mattered. They were the music of hope. But hope did not fill bellies. What was given had to be shared. Once the alms line returned to the colony, the food and coins were collected, counted, and divided. The strongest residents, or those tasked with caregiving, handled the portions. They tried to be fair, though there were always whispers of favoritism. The bread was sliced thin. The coins saved for firewood, medicine, or mending. Sometimes the day's yield was enough for a small meal for all. Sometimes it wasn't. And on the worst days, when no one came, or when the line was turned away, the hunger was sharp and unforgiving. No one starved outright, not immediately. The colony had stores of grain, occasional deliveries from distant monasteries, small gardens inside the walls. But these were not enough. Not always. The line existed to fill the gap between survival and malnutrition, to fill the bellies of those too sick to tend crops, too weak to boil water, too far gone to chew. And when the line failed, those people suffered first. There was pride in the line, a strange, quiet pride. The residents dressed themselves before stepping out, pulling on their least torn robes, wrapping their wounds, brushing their hair if they still had it. They did not go to bed looking like corpses. They went looking like people. Scarred, yes. Bent, yes. But still people. For those who could no longer work or cook or clean, standing in that line was their contribution to the community. They endured the stares, the insults, the indifference, so that others inside might eat. The young ones learned early. If a child inside the colony was old enough to stand, old enough to walk a few steps, they stood in the line, sometimes with their parents, sometimes alone. They clutched their own bowls. They watched the road with large, solemn eyes. And when a kind soul dropped something into their hands, they smiled with all the light left in them. The alms line hardened them quickly, but it also gave them purpose. It showed them they still mattered. And sometimes kindness did come. There were townspeople who gave regularly not for salvation, but out of real compassion. A baker who left loaves near the gate, a widow who brought broth each Tuesday, a nun who pressed rosemary sprigs into the hands of the sick, whispering for courage. These gestures, small as they were, filled more than stomachs. They filled hearts. They reminded the lepers that they had not been fully forgotten. Some of the colony's elders remembered a time before they needed the line. They spoke of full tables, of fat geese at Christmas time, of fresh milk and warm bread. They had fed others once. They had passed coins to beggars, not imagining they would one day need the same. The reversal stung. Some wept in secret after alms were gathered. Others laughed bitterly, their eyes far away. Life, they said, was a wheel, and no one knew where they might be when it turned. The line was also dangerous. During outbreaks of plague or unrest, the colony became even more feared. Gates were barred tighter. Guards refused to allow the sick near. The line was banned. Residents who dared approach the boundary were chased away with sticks or worse. Hunger grew fierce in those weeks. Some whispered of stealing into town at night. Most were too ill to try. A few vanished trying anyway. And yet, day after day, they returned. The line reformed. The bowls were held out. The eyes searched the horizon. It was not only food they waited for. It was recognition. It was a sign that they still existed, that they had not been erased from the world completely. A crust of bread said, "I see you." A coin said, "You matter still." For those in the line, the shame faded over time. It was replaced by resolve. They held out their bowls not with begging hands, but with steady ones. They had no illusions. They knew what they were in the eyes of the world, but they also knew they were more. That beneath the scars and silence, they carried souls full of longing and light. That the act of standing there each morning, waiting, hoping, enduring, was itself an act of courage. And so the line stretched on, through fog and rain, through snow and heat, through grief and sickness. It became a thread of connection between the colony and the world outside, a bridge of humility and necessity, a prayer, whispered without words, that anyone might answer. The bowls waited, the faces watched, and still they stood. Before the sun rose fully above the jagged rooftops and smoke-streaked chimneys of the outside world, the alms line had already begun to form. Hunched figures, wrapped in layers of tattered cloth, stood quietly beside the gates of the leper colony. Their bodies were still, but their eyes watched the horizon. Some held wooden bowls or cups carved by their own hands. Others carried baskets or small cloth sacks. No one spoke. The line was not just a line. It was a ritual and act of survival, cloaked in humility, performed day after day, regardless of weather or mood or dignity. In the early years of a resident's life inside the leper colony, stepping into that line for the first time was one of the most difficult acts they would face. The line could wait for hours and go home with nothing, not because it required effort, but because it required surrender. They crossed to the other side of the road. Others came too close not to give, but to mock. Children dared one another to toss stones near the gate. A drunk might stumble up and laugh, shouting crude jokes or spitting into the dirt. The sick said nothing. They stood. They waited. They hoped. It meant admitting dependence. It meant offering oneself to the mercy of others, to strangers outside the gates who might sneer or pity or look away. The sick were not allowed to cross into town. The line was as close as they could get to the lives they once lived. They whispered prayers into the cold air, voices trembling as much from emotion as from illness. The strongest residents, or those tasked with caregiving, handled the portions. The colony had stores of grain, occasional deliveries from distant monasteries, small gardens inside the walls. But these were not enough. Not always. The line existed to fill the gap between survival and malnutrition. They did not go to bed looking like corpses. They went looking like people. Scarred, yes. Bent, yes. But still people. For those who could no longer work or cook or clean, standing in that line was their contribution to the community. They endured the stares, the insults, the indifference, so that others inside might eat. To fill the bellies of those too sick to tend crops, too weak to boil water, too far gone to chew. And when the line failed, those people suffered first. Sometimes with their parents, sometimes alone. They clutched their own bowls. They watched the road with large, solemn eyes. And when a kind soul dropped something into their hands, they smiled with all the light left in them. The alms line hardened them quickly, but it also gave them purpose. It showed them they still mattered. They tried to be fair, though there were always whispers of favoritism. The bread was sliced thin. The coins saved for firewood, medicine, or mending. The eyes searched the horizon. It was not only food they waited for. It was recognition. It was a sign that they still existed, that they had not been erased from the world completely. A crust of bread said, "I see you." A coin said, "You matter still." A baker who left loaves near the gate. A widow who brought broth each Tuesday. A nun who pressed rosemary sprigs into the hands of the sick, whispering, they knew what they were in the eyes of the world, but they also knew they were more. That beneath the scars and silence, they carried souls full of longing and light. It became a thread of connection between the colony and the world outside. A bridge of humility and necessity. A prayer, whispered without words, that anyone might answer. That the act of standing there each morning, waiting, hoping, enduring, was itself an act of courage. They had fed others once. They had passed coins to beggars, not imagining they would one day need the same. The reversal stung. Some wept in secret after alms were gathered. Others laughed bitterly, their eyes far away. Life, they said, was a wheel, and no one knew where they might be when it turned. For courage. These gestures, small as they were, filled more than stomachs. They filled hearts. They reminded the lepers that they had not been fully forgotten. Sometimes the day's yield was enough for a small meal for all. Sometimes it wasn't. Singing was not for the people outside. It was for the line itself, for those who stood in it. Others were cracked and worn smooth from years of use. A few used tin cups or chipped clay vessels. When a coin landed inside, it made a sharp sound that echoed briefly in the stillness. The line was banned. Residents who dared approach the boundary were chased away with sticks or worse. Hunger grew fierce in those weeks. Some whispered of stealing into town at night. Most were too ill to try. A few vanished trying anyway. When a piece of bread landed, it thudded softly. These sounds mattered. They were the music of hope. It was a reminder that they were still human, that they still had breath, that their voices hadn't yet been taken by the disease. Beyond the threshold, they became shadows of what they had been, no longer farmers or mothers or craftsmen, but lepers begging for sustenance, not from affection, but from duty. Almsgiving was one of the 7 corporal acts of mercy, and giving to lepers was seen as especially virtuous. It was believed that helping the sick, especially those deemed cursed, could bring the giver closer to salvation. So on Sundays, churchgoers sometimes arrived with small bundles, crusts of bread, bruised apples, leftover stew sealed in clay pots. Children, taught to avert their gaze from the sick, sometimes snuck sweets through the gate when their parents weren't looking. The gates were always locked. A small hatch or grill was opened each morning by a caretaker or one of the colony's healthier residents. They placed a sign nearby, sometimes a bell or a wooden plank with painted letters reminding passers-by of the leper's needs. Some colonies posted a psalm or a prayer alongside it, hoping scripture might soften the hearts of those who walked past. Blessed are the merciful, it might say, or what you do for the least of these, you do for me. But not everyone read, and fewer still stopped. The line was often longest on holy days. Feast days, saints' days, the Sabbath, these were when townspeople were most likely to give. But the rest of the week? Some days the townspeople hurried past. They didn't want to look at the twisted hands, the disfigured faces, the sores wrapped in dirty cloth. Sometimes they sang, not loudly, never loudly, but in soft murmurs, as if to soothe their own pride. They chanted hymns or old folk songs. The bowls were simple. Most were carved by hand from scraps of wood. Some were adorned with etched symbols, crosses, initials, a sun, a bird. But hope did not fill bellies. What was given had to be shared. Once the alms line returned to the colony, the food and coins were collected, counted, and divided. And on the worst days, when no one came, or when the line was turned away, the hunger was sharp and unforgiving. No one starved outright, not immediately. There was pride in the line, a strange, quiet pride. The residents dressed themselves before stepping out, pulling on their least-torn robes, wrapping their wounds, brushing their hair if they still had it. The young ones learned early. If a child inside the colony was old enough to stand, old enough to walk a few steps, they stood in the line. And sometimes kindness did come. There were townspeople who gave regularly, not for salvation, but out of real compassion. Some of the colony's elders remembered a time before they needed the line. They spoke of full tables, of fat geese at Christmas time, of fresh milk and warm bread. The line was also dangerous. During outbreaks of plague or unrest, the colony became even more feared. Gates were barred tighter. Guards refused to allow the sick near. And yet, day after day, they returned. The line reformed. The bowls were held out. For those in the line, the shame faded over time. It was replaced by resolve. They held out their bowls not with begging hands, but with steady ones. They had no illusions, and so the line stretched on, through fog and rain, through snow and heat, through grief and sickness. The bowls waited, the faces watched, and still they stood. For those cast out from ordinary life, the garments they wore became more than just protection from the elements. They were the fabric of isolation itself. The leper's garb was not simply clothing. It was a statement, a signal, and a sentence woven in thread and cloth. Those with leprosy, deemed unclean and cursed, were made to wear special garments designed to announce their presence to others. The purpose was clear: to warn, to keep distance, and to enforce the boundaries between us and them. This garment was often thick and coarse, designed to protect against cold and rain, but also to make the wearer unmistakable from a distance. Sometimes cloaks bore symbols embroidered or painted onto the fabric. A red cross was common, a mark associated with the sick and the dying, but also with Christian charity. It declared the wearer's separation from normal society, their status as other. Townspeople feared leprosy, not only because of its physical symptoms, but because of what it represented, a visible manifestation of sin, death, and divine punishment. The garb made this fear tangible and reinforced the isolation of the sick. It also prevented accidental contact, which could spread fear or, as was believed, contagion. The sound was a daily reminder of the life they had lost and of the stigma they bore. The leper's garb was designed to erase individuality and enforce uniformity in suffering. Yet within this forced conformity, small acts of defiance flickered. A hand-sewn patch here, a discreet embroidery there, tiny threads of personality and hope woven into the fabric of despair. They protected against the cold winds and the biting rain, but they also cloaked the wearer in invisibility and silence. To be seen, but not truly seen. Others were large and clangorous, demanding attention and warning all who heard them. On cold winter days, they layered their cloaks more heavily, wrapping scarves or shawls around their faces for warmth. In the distance, their shapes moved slowly, cloaked and hooded, bells ringing softly through the morning mist. Those who had been residents for many years sometimes accumulated slightly better or more worn clothing, passed down from newcomers or acquired through favors. New arrivals, by contrast, might receive the roughest, most threadbare robes. The division was a quiet hierarchy within an already fractured world. For them, the hood was not just a piece of cloth, but a signifier of their place in a hidden society. On occasion, outsiders, travelers, pilgrims, or clergy would bring new garments, thread, or bells as gifts. When a leper left the colony, whether through recovery or death, the removal or absence of the hood and bell marked a transformation. The shedding of the garb was a symbolic rebirth, a crossing back into the realm of the living and the accepted. For those who recovered, this was a hard-earned victory, celebrated with quiet relief. For those who died, the garments were folded and laid aside, their tolling bells silenced. These offerings were treasured, seen as signs that the wearer was remembered and cared for beyond the walls of the colony. It was a daily reminder of separation, but also a symbol of endurance. Worn not only as a mark of affliction, but as armor against despair, the clothes gave the wearer a form, a presence, a voice in a world that had otherwise silenced them. Some lepers would polish their bells until they shone or carefully mend their cloaks, not only for warmth, but as a way of preserving their dignity. Some made their own small bells or decorated their cloaks with bits of fabric or beads found in the dust. In these small ways, they claimed a bit of joy and creativity within lives otherwise defined by loss and restriction. To the townspeople, this was a sign of divine judgment, a reminder of human frailty and the limits of mercy. Stories of pain and rejection, but also of quiet courage, of a people bound not only by disease, but by a shared will to endure, to be seen, and to exist. Thick cloaks and hoods helped keep the wearer warm, but they also prevented open sores from being exposed to the air, which could cause infection or attract flies. The fabric absorbed smells and sweat, sometimes making the wearer's presence more pungent and unpleasant to others. Yet for the sick, these clothes were all they had to maintain some sense of bodily privacy. To the lepers, it was a form of identity painful, yes, but undeniable. In the summer, lighter fabrics might be patched onto the hood or draped loosely over the shoulders to allow for some air. Despite these adaptations, the overall appearance remained unmistakable. The leper's garb was a uniform of exclusion, worn with quiet endurance. In moments of despair, the ringing could offer rhythm and a strange kind of comfort, a sound that marked their existence in time. The constant jingling became a rhythm for those inside the colony, a sound that mingled with coughing, footsteps, and whispered prayers. The bell was a tether to the outside world, a reminder that though separated, the lepers still moved within a shared space. Some believed that the bell's voice could carry prayers or curses, hopes or laments, as it echoed through the empty streets. The choice of bell could affect how the wearer was treated by those outside the colony. A louder bell might keep people farther away, but might also invite more fear or scorn. A softer bell could sometimes allow a leper to move with slightly less hostility, but carried the risk of accidental contact, to be present but excluded. The robes and cloaks could cover wounds and scars, but never the pain beneath. Many who lived in the colonies fashioned their clothing with care, despite their condition, mending tears as best they could, trying to maintain some dignity in the way they appeared to the outside world. They formed part of a ritual language understood by all. The wearer's posture, the way the hood shadowed the eyes, the cadence of the bell's toll, the color and condition of the cloak all spoke volumes. Townspeople might recognize a certain pattern, a sign that a particular leper had been confined to the colony for years, or that another was newly arrived and still adjusting to the harsh realities. For the leper, the bell was a heavy chain wrapped not around the wrists, but around the soul. Even in their exclusion, Lepers formed communities where the garb was a shared symbol of fate and resilience. Clothes were often handed down or patched together from scraps, and each piece told a story. A cloak frayed at the edges might have shielded its wearer through several harsh winters. A bell with a cracked handle might have rung through countless lonely nights. These garments carried memory and meaning. Some carried it with a resigned dignity, while others hid their faces in despair. Upon admission to the colony, residents were stripped of their personal belongings, ordinary clothes, keepsakes, even names sometimes. They were dressed instead in the prescribed attire, a transformation that marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. The moment the hood was placed on their head, the bell hung at their side, the cloak wrapped around their shoulders, they were officially separated from the world they once knew. The cross was a paradoxical symbol here, a sign of suffering and a reminder of faith, a call for mercy amidst exclusion. This separation was physical, but also psychological and spiritual. The garments created an invisible barrier of fear and shame. From the moment one crossed the threshold into the colony, the worn and torn robes, the heavy cloaks, the stiff hoods, and the jangling bells marked the wearer as someone both present and untouchable. In medieval Europe, societies developed an unspoken language of exclusion through clothing. The most recognizable piece of this leper's attire was the hood, often pointed and stiff, sometimes known as a cowl. These hoods were large enough to cover much of the face, hiding the sores and deformities that many tried desperately to conceal. The fabric was usually heavy wool or rough linen, dyed in dull, muted colors, grays, browns, and faded yellows that mirrored the somberness of their lives. The weight of the hood, dragging down around the shoulders, seemed to mimic the burden the wearer carried within. Attached to the hood or worn separately was the leper's cloak. But perhaps the most haunting element of the leper's garb was the bell. Hung from the wrist, the belt, or the cloak itself, the bell rang out as the leper moved through the village streets or along the paths outside the colony walls. The sharp, metallic clang was a warning, a call to others to keep away. It was a sound both feared and pitied, a summons that cut through the chatter of daily life and silenced those who heard it. In some places, the ringing of the bell was accompanied by a chant or cry, "Unclean, unclean," to further alert all who might approach. The bell's toll was not merely a practical warning. It carried a deeper meaning. Clothing the sick in such a way was an act of social control as much as protection. For the lepers themselves, the garments were both a shield and a cage. Inside the colony, clothing was also a marker of identity and belonging. The process of receiving the leper's garb was itself a ritual steeped in sorrow. This ceremony was not without its cruelties. Some colonies enforced strict dress codes, punishing those who tried to hide their disease or who wore items deemed too fine or too colorful. The bells themselves varied in design and sound, depending on region and tradition. Some were small and delicate, chiming softly with each step. There were those among the lepers who came to view the bell as a companion, an ever-present reminder of their reality, but also a link to the world beyond the colony walls. The garments and bells were not only practical but symbolic, deeply woven into the culture surrounding leprosy. Some chroniclers and observers of the time noted how lepers would modify their garb depending on the season or circumstance. The visual impact of a group of lepers dressed in their distinctive clothing was both haunting and heart-wrenching. Not all garments were equal, and the quality of a leper's clothing often reflected their status within the colony. The leper's garb also played a role in practical hygiene and care within the colony. Throughout the day, the bell's ringing marked the leper's presence in a sonic landscape that was both oppressive and oddly communal. Children born or raised within the colony quickly learned the significance of the garments and the bells. The leper's garb, for all its cruelty, also inspired unexpected acts of compassion and connection. In some rare instances, The leper's garb could be a means of negotiating identity beyond illness. Yet for most, the leper's garb remained a constant companion until the end. In the stillness of the colony's walls, as dawn broke and the bells began their slow, mournful ringing, the leper's garb told stories without words. The leper's clothing was the fabric of exile, but also the thread that wove the scattered souls of the colony into a fragile tapestry of humanity. Within the cold stone walls of the leper colony, amid the rough-hewn beds and the constant scent of herbs in decay, religion was both refuge and lifeline. The rhythms of daily prayer shaped life here, as surely as the tolling of the bells or the turning of the seasons. From the faintest light of dawn, the sick and weary gathered, some in small makeshift chapels, others in the open courtyards, with the sky arched over them like a great silent witness. Though many of the residents were too weak to stand, those who could rose to their feet and joined the chants. The prayers were often the only moments of communal gathering, where the walls of isolation thinned and voices lifted together in fragile unity. It was a time when the boundaries between the healthy and the sick seemed to blur, if only for a little while. Feast days dedicated to the saints brought small celebrations, prayers, and sometimes even music, a rare glimpse of joy amid hardship. Clergy or visiting monks conducted masses, reading scripture aloud and offering communion to those who could partake. They asked for strength to bear pain, for forgiveness for sins thought to have brought the disease, and for deliverance from isolation. At times, they pleaded simply for death, an end to suffering that seemed endless. Yet more often, they asked for healing, for a cure, a chance to step back into the world they had lost. Letters, donations, and news often came through them, reminding residents that they were not forgotten by the church or by God. Some clergy recorded the lives of the lepers in chronicles, preserving their stories and prayers for posterity. For some, faith brought comfort and purpose. For others, it was a source of torment. The belief that leprosy was a punishment for sin weighed heavily on many hearts. Confession and penance were constant companions, as residents wrestled with guilt and shame. Some questioned why their prayers went unanswered, why God seemed silent in their suffering. These ceremonies reinforced a shared identity, not just as sufferers, but as people bound together by faith. It gave the sick a voice when the world had silenced them, a way to express their hopes and fears. It forged bonds between individuals, weaving a fabric of shared faith that could soften even the harshest realities. The simple act of kneeling to pray, of crossing oneself, of lighting a candle, became acts of defiance against despair. Their voices, soft but steady, rose in the ancient language of faith, calling out for mercy, for healing, for peace. Through the prayers, they reached beyond the colony's walls, into the hearts of a world that often wished to forget them, asking simply to be remembered and to be healed. A hand that once trembled with weakness might be steady again. A face swollen with sores might clear. These stories were cherished, shared in hushed tones, and sometimes celebrated with thanksgiving prayers and feasts, however small. Hope, fragile but unyielding, endured in whispered prayers and quiet masses. For many, the belief in a cure, whether in this life or the next, was a beacon in the long night of exile. The prayers were whispered and sung, carried on breath, roughened by coughs and pain, yet never losing their steady cadence. Many residents kept prayer books or small crosses close at hand, whispering private pleas and confessions throughout the day. Some carved prayers or symbols into their wooden bowls or beds, marking their own spaces with signs of devotion. The act of praying itself became a rhythm that gave structure to the long hours spent waiting, hoping, and enduring. Many were monks or priests who had chosen to dedicate themselves to this marginalized community, facing the same fears and stigma from the outside world. They administered last rites, heard confessions, and offered blessings. They tended not only to spiritual wounds, but sometimes to physical ones, applying poultices or encouraging basic care when possible. Saint Roch, often depicted with a sore on his leg and accompanied by a loyal dog, was among the most revered. He was believed to have survived the plague and leprosy by divine grace, making him a symbol of hope for the afflicted. Residents would touch his image or pray before small icons, asking for his intercession. Saint Lazarus, another key figure, was the patron saint of lepers and beggars, embodying both suffering and redemption. They called to saints and to God, pleading for relief from suffering, for strength to endure, and above all, for a cure. For those cast out from the world, faith was a balm for the body and soul, a fragile hope clinging to the promise of healing, mercy, and perhaps even a miracle. Each day inside the colony began and ended with prayers. The religious rituals inside the colony had a solemn beauty, a sacred order amidst chaos. Central to the colony's faith life were the saints, especially those known as healers and protectors. Pilgrimages to the shrines of these saints were sometimes undertaken by the more able-bodied residents or by visiting clergy. The journey was arduous, often filled with risk, but for many, the chance to touch a relic or to be blessed by a holy figure was worth every hardship. The belief was that such acts could bring healing, whether through divine intervention or through the comfort of spiritual assurance. Inside the colony, holy days punctuated the calendar with moments of heightened devotion. Prayer was not only a communal act, but deeply personal. The content of these prayers reflected the harsh realities of life in the colony. Miracles were sought with desperate hope. Tales of those who had been healed spread through the colony like whispered legends, offering flickers of light in the darkness. The clergy who served the colony played a vital role, both as spiritual guides and as comforters. Their presence brought more than rituals. The clergy were links to the broader Christian world outside the colony's walls. The power of prayer in the colony was both real and symbolic. Yet the spiritual life of the colony was not without tension. Despite these doubts, the rituals persisted. And so, day after day, within the stone walls and under the gray skies, the lepers prayed. Beyond the stone walls of the leper colony, life pulsed with a rhythm that was distant yet vivid. For those confined within, the world outside was both a tantalizing mystery and a cruel reminder of what had been lost. Through cracks in wooden slats, gaps in fences, or the narrow spaces between gate bars, the residents caught fleeting glimpses of a life from which they were painfully excluded. A world filled with laughter, movement, and human connection. Market stalls bustled with activity, the shouts of vendors, the clatter of wooden carts, the colorful displays of fresh fruit and fabric. In spring, the air beyond the walls carried the scent of blooming flowers and freshly turned earth. The view was limited, a framed glimpse rather than a full panorama. They saw shadows and shapes, colors and movement, but never the touch or the smell of that other life. The boundaries were cruel reminders of their exclusion barriers, not just of stone and wood, but of fear, judgment, and misunderstanding. Birds sang melodies that mingled with the distant sounds of church bells calling the faithful to prayer. Some would watch for hours, memorizing the faces of passers-by, the way a child's laughter rippled through the air, or the pattern of footsteps on the cobblestones. They saw the weather's effects, the frost glittering on rooftops, the sudden downpour sending villagers scrambling for shelter, the lazy drift of snowflakes in winter. These observations grounded them in time, connecting their isolated lives to the broader cycles of the world. These brief encounters were precious moments when the worlds touched, however fleetingly. Some residents watched for familiar faces or longed for more frequent contact, while others withdrew, wary of disappointment or cruelty. Others would imagine stories about the lives beyond, who those people were, what their days were like, what dreams they chased. They were symbols of a fractured world, of lives divided by illness and fear. Yet even in this separation, the residents found ways to connect to each other and, in their own way, to the outside. Stories of outbreaks, conflicts, or harsh punishments traveled through the colony, often distorted by rumor and fear. Residents knew that they were seen as a threat by those beyond the walls, a risk to be avoided or eliminated. This perception deepened the divide and hardened the sense of exile. On festival days, when the village streets swelled with music and celebration, the residents inside the colony would retreat to the shadows, hearing the distant sounds like a muted echo of a happiness they could no longer claim. Their own voices, weakened by disease, would sometimes join in soft, solitary prayers or whispered songs, bridges of sound, reaching out to the joyful throngs just beyond the gate. These imagined narratives offered a brief escape, a momentary connection to a world that otherwise felt unreachable. Summer brought the warmth of sunlight and the hum of insects, the scent of baked bread and wood smoke drifting in from the village hearths. It was also a source of pain. Seeing families reunited, parents holding children close, neighbors sharing meals and laughter, reminded the lepers of the ties they had severed. Many had lost homes, spouses, children, or friends. For them, it was a place of curiosity and yearning, often mingled with confusion. They knew the fences were meant to keep them in and the villagers out, but they also saw the world's beauty, the colors, the sounds, the faces. Some dared to imagine crossing the threshold, running freely through fields, or joining other children in play. Others learned early the harsh lesson that such dreams were forbidden. The sight of happy faces was a sharp cake, a silent testament to what illness and exile had taken away. Autumn painted the trees in fiery hues, and markets overflowed with the harvest's bounty. Winter cloaked the landscape in frost and silence, but even then, the world outside carried on, indifferent to the stillness within. Tradesmen and farmers moved with purpose, their bodies whole and unscarred, engaged in the work of everyday life. These scenes were distant echoes of a normal existence that many inside the colony had once known. The fences that encircled the colony were often rough-hewn and sturdy, built to contain, but not entirely to conceal. Between the knots of wood and iron nails, eyes peered out. Children pressed their faces against the slats, their breath fogging the cold air, watching in silence. They saw other children in the village beyond running, chasing, playing games with shrieks of delight that echoed faintly through the air. The simple joys of a ball rolling on cobblestones or a game of tag were scenes as precious as any treasure to those inside. For the adults, the view was bittersweet. Lovers walked hand in hand along the village lanes, their whispered words carried faintly by the breeze. The world outside was a living tapestry of seasons and celebrations. But for those inside, the colony's walls were both protection and prison. Many residents developed rituals around these glimpses. Yet the world outside was not merely an object of wistful longing. There were moments when the boundary between the two worlds felt especially stark. Children born or raised inside the colony experienced the world outside through a different lens. From their vantage points, the residents also noticed the rhythms of daily life beyond the walls, the changing of seasons marked by activities outside, the comings and goings of merchants, the routines of church bells and market calls. Yet the world outside also carried dangers, real and imagined. Visitors who came to the colony sometimes brought news or small gifts, cloth, or tokens of kindness. The walls, the fences, the barred gates, they were more than physical barriers. Through slats and fences, through whispered prayers and hopeful eyes, the lepers reached out. They watched, they remembered, and they dreamed. In a world marked by pain, exclusion, and endless routine, feast days and fast days stood out as moments of fragile joy and deep reflection. Within the austere stone walls of the leper colony, these days broke the monotony of survival, offering not just food or ritual, but a rare permission to smile, to hope, and to connect. They were both sacred and secular, a time when sorrow was softened, and the community's fragile bonds were strengthened. Residents helped clean common spaces, mend worn garments, and sometimes carved small decorations from scraps of wood or dried herbs. Meals, usually sparse and plain, were prepared with extra care and generosity. Small additions, fragrant herbs, a few extra vegetables, or a slice of bread thicker than usual transformed simple fare into a feast, however humble. Sometimes a visiting priest or a few of the stronger residents sang hymns or folk songs, their voices weaving through the cold stone walls like threads of warmth. The liturgy connected the colony to the wider Christian world, a reminder that despite their exile, the residents were part of a larger community of faith. Lent, Fridays, and other designated days required fasting or abstinence from certain foods. These days underscored the reality of suffering, calling the residents to spiritual discipline, even as their bodies ached from illness. The sacred and the secular blended seamlessly. Meals were blessings, and blessings were feasts for the soul. Joy and sorrow, abundance and scarcity, celebration and penance, they were woven together like threads in a tapestry, reflecting the complexity of existence, even in exile. Despite the hardships of their lives, they remembered these times as bright points when the colony was filled with light, laughter, and small treasures like sweets or extra bread. Some found renewed courage to face illness. Others felt the bittersweet sting of what had been lost. The shared meals and prayers were acts of defiance, assertions of life and community in the face of isolation and death. These actions infused meaning into everyday objects, transforming the harsh environment into a sacred space where hope could bloom. Their presence reminded residents that beyond the colony's walls, they were not forgotten. These encounters, though rare, were treasured and recounted long afterward, becoming part of the colony's collective memory. Feast days and fast days were more than mere points on a calendar. They were lifelines, moments when the heavy silence was broken and the colony's heart beat with renewed strength. Elders told stories of past feasts, of larger celebrations before exile, passing on memories and traditions. Those stronger or more skilled helped organize food and space. Herbalists and healers contributed ingredients or advice on health. Clergy coordinated services and comforted the sick. These cooperative efforts built connections that sustained the community long after the celebrations ended. They embodied the delicate balance between suffering and celebration, loss and hope. In these moments, the residents reclaimed a sense of identity, not just as lepers, but as human beings capable of joy, faith, and connection. These tales were a bridge between past and present, a reminder that life once held fullness and that joy could still be found. To willingly endure hunger was a way of sharing in the suffering of Christ, an act of humility and faith. For the lepers, whose bodies were already weakened by disease and deprivation, fasting demanded extraordinary resilience. It was a reminder of their humanity and their hope, even amid hardship. Instruments were scarce, but clapping hands, tapping feet, or a simple drum beat added rhythm. These sounds lifted spirits and momentarily dissolved the weight of suffering. For many, this was the only time in the year they tasted such bounty. The silence between words felt heavier, filled with unspoken grief and longing. Yet this solemnity also forged a deep sense of solidarity. Together, the residents bore their burdens and lifted their souls, finding strength in shared sacrifice. The air took on a different quality, a mix of expectation, warmth, and something almost festive, despite the harsh surroundings. Long wooden tables, rough-hewn but sturdy, were lined with those who might otherwise sit alone or apart. The act of eating together, breaking bread in company, became a profound statement of belonging and dignity. Smiles were exchanged, stories told, and laughter rare and fragile bubbled up from deep within. Feast days arrived like small bursts of light in a long shadowed calendar. These were occasions tied to the church's cycle: Christmas, Easter, the feast days of saints, especially those revered by the colony, like Saint Lazarus and Saint Roch. The entire colony prepared in quiet anticipation. Though celebrations were modest compared to the outside world's, their significance was immense. They marked the turning of the year, the rhythms of faith, and the resilience of the human spirit. In the days leading up to a feast, whispers of excitement fluttered through the colony like a secret breeze. On the morning of a feast day, the usual hunger in the colony was tempered by the promise of something more. Food was shared communally, often in the chapel or a larger common room. Music, too, found its way into the celebrations. Feast days were also times of prayer and ceremony. Masses were held, incense burned, and prayers lifted up for healing and peace. Yet alongside these moments of joy, the colony's calendar was also marked by fast days, times of solemnity, penance, and quiet endurance. Fasting was both a physical challenge and a spiritual exercise. Communal prayers on fast days took on a more somber tone. Hymns were slower, voices softer. The contrast between feast days and fast days created a rhythm that shaped life inside the colony. For children, feast days were moments of wonder and delight. Among the adults, feast days could rekindle old or deepen faith. Preparation for feast and fast days also revealed the colony's hidden networks of care. The rituals around these days often included symbolic acts, lighting candles to honor saints, washing hands or faces as purification, or sharing small gifts like carved crosses or sprigs of rosemary. At times, feast days brought visitors, relatives, clergy, or charity workers who offered gifts, prayers, or simply companionship. Despite the hardships, the colony's feast and fast days were threads of light woven through darkness. Through the shared breaking of bread, the lifting of voices in song, and the quiet endurance of fasts, the community found ways to nourish both body and soul. And so, through the cycles of the year, amid stone walls and whispered prayers, the people of the leper colony lived their faith in small, luminous moments, feasts and fasts that spoke of survival, resilience, and the enduring human spirit. Among the many symbols that marked a leper's existence, none was more haunting or more resonant than the bell. A simple object, small, metallic, unassuming in shape, yet its sound carried weight far beyond its size. In an age before modern medicine, leprosy was little understood. Its symptoms, wasting flesh, disfigured faces, and loss of limbs, terrified the healthy and stirred superstition. Communities feared accidental contact with the sick, believing the disease spread through touch or proximity. The bell's clear, sharp clang was meant to prevent this, warning passers-by to keep their distance. To those outside the colony, the bell was a warning. The bell warned others away, reducing accidental contact and potential violence. It allowed the leper some control over the distance between themselves and the outside world. Among the residents, the sound was familiar, a constant thread in the fabric of daily life. Bells rang as residents moved between work areas, chapels, and communal spaces. These small acts brought a sense of ownership and identity to an object otherwise imposed upon them. In this way, the bell transcended its role as mere warning device and became a symbol of endurance and resilience. For some, it was a reminder of isolation and loss. For others, it was a symbol of survival. The bell called out to the world, proclaiming presence and humanity in a society eager to silence and erase. Its ringing was a voice when words were denied, a testament that despite disease and exile, the leper still lived, breathed, and moved among them. The tone of a bell's ring could signal different things: an approaching visitor, a call to prayer, or a warning of danger. Others, moved by pity or faith, heard in its clang a call to charity and compassion. Clergy often interpreted the bell's toll as a summons to prayer or a reminder of human frailty. Some lepers embraced the symbol, using it as a sign of their endurance and faith. The bell's constant ringing could be seen as a declaration of presence, an affirmation that though excluded, they were still here, still human. In this way, the bell was both burden and badge. For them, the sound was intertwined with the spiritual lives of those who bore it. The bell was not only a mark of disease, but a part of community rhythms, a shared language of sound. It marks the boundary between life and death, health and sickness, acceptance and rejection. The bell's tolling has been described as the voice of the forgotten, carrying the stories of those cast out into the margins. In some regions, it was mandatory, strictly enforced by laws or local ordinances. It marked their separation from the world, but also connected them to a shared experience. The bell's ringing was a language of exclusion, but also, paradoxically, of identity and survival. In others, the practice was less rigid, and some lepers might avoid wearing one. The evolution of medical understanding and social attitudes gradually altered the bell's prominence. But for centuries, its clang remained the unmistakable soundtrack of leprosy's stigma. It resonates as a haunting reminder of medieval society's fears and the human cost of those fears. When the bell tolled, the healthy knew to keep their space, and the leper could move with a measure of safety. It was a tool of survival, a way to navigate a hostile environment. To the lepers who bore it, it was a mark of identity, a burden, and sometimes a bittersweet shield. It was heard at dawn when the colony stirred to life, accompanying slow footsteps to the alms line or the chapel. It rang during work or chores, accompanying labor in gardens or kitchens. As dusk fell, the bells tolled softly, blending with the murmur of prayers and the settling of the sick into their beds. The ringing of the bell was at once a cry for attention, a call for distance, and a reminder of a life irrevocably changed. Others were larger, producing a harsh, clanging ring that cut sharply through the air. The variety reflected regional customs, availability of materials, and individual circumstances. A worn bell, cracked or dented, might carry years of history-echoing footsteps through countless seasons, the ups and downs of a leper's life. The practice of making lepers wear bells grew from a deep-seated fear of contagion and a desire to enforce separation. The bell was usually worn on a leather strap around the wrist or hung from a belt. As the leper moved, the bell's ringing followed, a constant, unmistakable soundtrack to their presence. Where walls and fences divided the sick from the healthy, the bell broadcast their difference in a way no stone could. The sound was often met with avoidance, mockery, or cruelty. Children threw stones, men shouted jeers, and neighbors crossed the street to avoid crossing paths. The bell's ring was a reminder of rejection, a loud declaration of their otherness. Many lepers came to hate its sound, associating it with loneliness, shame, and sorrow. The clang pierced silence and space, creating a sonic barrier as tangible as any gate. It was a warning, a challenge, and a lament all at once. The sound echoed through village streets, marketplaces, and fields, announcing, "Here I am, keep away." For many, the bell became inseparable from their identity. It marked their passage through the world, a sonic shadow trailing their every step. This ringing was not just practical, but deeply symbolic. It gave shape and voice to the invisible walls of exclusion. For those who wore it, the bell could be a source of humiliation. It branded them publicly as outcasts, drawing stares, insults, and fear. Yet within this sound of exclusion was also a strange kind of protection. The bell also had a role within the colony itself. The physical bells themselves varied in size, shape, and tone. Some were small and delicate, producing a light, tinkling chime. Lepers sometimes personalized their bells. Some attached small charms, or wrapped leather straps with bits of cloth or thread. The bell's sound was a constant companion in the leper's daily existence, marking time and movement. The emotional weight of the bell's toll was often heavy. The sound could evoke different responses. Some townsfolk, hardened by fear or indifference, recoiled at the ringing. In literature and art from the period, the leper's bell appears as a powerful symbol. Despite its painful connotations, the bell sometimes became a source of pride. The bell's role changed over time and place. For the lepers themselves, the bell was entwined with daily life, a sound that accompanied every step and breath. In the silence that followed each toll, the leper's bell spoke volumes of fear, of resilience, of loneliness, and of the enduring will to be seen and heard. Inside the stone walls of the leper colony, where illness and isolation seemed to dominate every moment, the work of the hands offered a precious counterpoint. Simple, repetitive, and often humble tasks making pottery, weaving cloth, tending gardens, these acts became lifelines, threads of meaning woven through days, marked by silence and suffering. These tasks were often tailored to the abilities of individuals, adapted to accommodate wounds, stiffness, or fatigue. The work was neither glamorous nor easy, but it was vital. It provided a rhythm, a structure to the long hours, and a tangible product that affirmed the worker's presence and value. For the residents, work was more than just survival. It was a way to reclaim a sense of identity, purpose, and community amid exile. Within the colony's walls, small plots were cultivated with whatever soil was available. Residents tended herbs, rosemary, lavender, sage believed to have healing properties, as well as vegetables and fruits to supplement meager rations. An experienced potter might guide a younger resident's hands, a gardener might exchange seeds and tips, and a weaver might pass down techniques. These exchanges were acts of kindness and continuity, stitching together a fragile fabric of companionship. Gardening was physical labor, but also a form of hope, a way to nurture life and sustenance amid decay. The act of planting, watering, and harvesting connected the sick to the earth's rhythms, reminding them of cycles beyond illness and death. When illness pulled bodies into weakness and minds into despair, the tasks at hand demanded attention and effort. Whenever possible, they organized schedules that balanced rest and activity, encouraged teaching of skills, and ensured that tools and materials were available. The goal was not productivity alone, but fostering a sense of normalcy and belonging. It declared that the residents were not mere victims or outcasts, but people capable of creation, care, and contribution. Each pot shaped, each thread woven, each seed planted was a step toward reclaiming identity and agency. The tactile nature of the work, the feel of wet clay, the roughness of wool, the smell of soil-grounded individuals in the physical world, offering respite from pain and worry. Pots dried by the firelight, cloths folded and stacked, gardens resting under the moon. These tangible remnants of effort spoke of lives lived with intention and hope. These exchanges carried meaning away for the colony to reach out. To assert its presence, many residents infused their tasks with prayer or intention, seeing their labor as acts of devotion. Bodies weakened by leprosy sometimes refused to cooperate, hands trembled or stiffened, and projects went unfinished. Yet even these moments held value, a testament to human perseverance. The act of trying, despite limitations, was itself a form of courage. Shaping clay into vessels was a form of creation, mirroring divine acts. The work of the hands wove a quiet tapestry of resilience, a testament that even in exile and illness, life could be shaped and tended with care. Weaving threads was likened to weaving the fabric of life itself. Tending the garden echoed biblical themes of stewardship and renewal. These layers of meaning brought comfort and a sense of sacred purpose. And to remind the outside world that its residents were still makers and members of a larger society, the clay, dug from nearby earth or brought in by visitors, was molded by hands worn yet skilled. In the quiet hours, the sounds of clay scraping, looms clacking, and garden tools digging filled the air, creating a subtle symphony of effort and endurance. These noises were not merely functional. They were expressions of life, continuing despite hardship. Holding a tool, sorting threads, or watering a few plants offered moments of participation and dignity. Work was inclusive, a way to contribute regardless of the body's limitations. They were proof that the colony was more than a place of suffering. It was a community of makers, doers, and survivors. Residents shaped bowls, cups, plates, and small jugs objects that held both practical and symbolic significance. Pottery was used daily for meals, water, and storage, making each piece a quiet companion to survival. Some vessels bore simple decorations, etched lines, crosses, or symbols of faith, small acts of creativity that transformed clay into something personal and meaningful. Despite the ravages of disease that disfigured bodies and sapped strength, many lepers retained enough vigor to engage in manual labor. The shaping required focus and patience, a distraction from pain and fear. The kiln, a modest structure tended by a few, became a site of transformation, where fragile clay became durable and functional. For many, the finished pottery was a source of pride, a testament to skill and perseverance. Pottery was one of the most common crafts within the colony. Threads were spun from wool or flax, dyed with natural pigments, and woven into cloth for clothing, blankets, or bandages. The repetitive motion of weaving offered a calming ritual, a tactile engagement that soothed restless minds. Woven textiles, often patched and mended over time, carried the stories of those who made them, threads intertwined with patience, care, and resilience. The process of pottery making was meditative. Hands softened the earth, pressing and shaping, coaxing life from lifeless material. Weaving was another vital craft, especially for those whose illness limited mobility. Gardening, too, played an essential role. The work of the hands broke the silence that hung heavy in the colony. Work also fostered social bonds. Tasks were often shared or taught from one resident to another, creating networks of knowledge and support. Even for those too weak to work daily, observing or assisting in small ways brought connection. The products of this labor had value beyond the colony. Some items were traded or given as gifts to visitors, clergy, or nearby villagers. Beyond practicality, the work of the hands held spiritual significance. Work also helped to anchor the residents in the present. The colony's leaders recognized the importance of work for mental and physical well-being. There were moments of frustration and failure, of course. The work of the hands was a silent rebellion against the disease's dehumanizing force. In the evenings, when the day's labor wound down, the colony often felt the presence of this work in the quiet. For many, these tasks were more than survival. They were acts of grace, moments of beauty in a harsh world. And so, through clay and thread, soil and sweat, the lepers worked not just to endure, but to live. The gates of the leper colony rarely opened without a mixture of apprehension and routine. But when a stranger arrived new to the place, new to the heavy silence, the atmosphere shifted in subtle yet profound ways. Their clothes were tattered or mismatched, their face marked with the telltale signs of disease, a swollen hand, a discolored patch of skin, a face partially hidden beneath a hood. Some came willingly, knowing that the colony might offer shelter, care, and companionship in the face of relentless illness. The colony's residents gathered quietly, not out of suspicion, but out of recognition. They saw in the stranger's eyes the same questions they themselves once had, the same blend of fear and hope, resignation and resilience. They were shown to a modest space, a bed, a stool, a few simple belongings. Some offered small gifts, bread, a cloth, a sprig of herb, tokens of kindness that spoke louder than words. The faces around them were both strange and familiar, mirrors reflecting their own pain and hope. Here, among others marked by the same affliction, the stranger began to shed the heavy cloak of solitude. Others shared advice or whispered prayers for strength and healing. The stranger lay among others, whose breaths rose and fell in time, whose whispered prayers mingled in the dark. They learned the rhythms of daily life, the soft murmur of prayers, the gentle clang of the bells, the shared labor in gardens and workshops. Each arrival carried new threads of humanity into the tapestry of the community, stories of loss, endurance, and sometimes unexpected kindness. The stranger was both a newcomer and a vital part of the colony's living history. Slowly, they took part in work, joined the alms line, and entered the circle of communal meals. The arrival of a stranger was a profound moment and invitation into a shared journey, marked by courage, compassion, and the enduring human will to belong. Each step was a quiet affirmation of survival and acceptance. Though sleep might come fitfully, there was a new comfort in proximity, in shared experience. These acts formed a subtle ritual of initiation, a passage from isolation into community. The routine of the colony was explained: the daily prayers, the meal times, the alms line, the work tasks. The colony was not just a place of exile, but a sanctuary, a place where suffering was shared, and hope, however faint, was nurtured. Though unfamiliar, these rhythms were steady, offering a measure of comfort amid uncertainty. No words were needed. The shared experience of leprosy created an immediate, unspoken bond. Others were forced, driven by relatives or town officials who sought to rid the village of the visible curse. The journey itself was a rite of passage, filled with dread and uncertainty, a slow march away from familiar faces and places toward a future unknown. They carried with them an invisible weight, the fear of exile, the sting of rejection, the unknowns of a new life. For many, the journey to the colony was a journey toward an ending. Yet it was also, unexpectedly, a beginning. It stirred memories of their own arrival, their own fears and hopes. It renewed a sense of solidarity and compassion, binding the community tighter in its shared fate. Each arrival was a moment of transition, not only for the newcomer, but for the entire community. It was a passage from the outside world of fear, shame, and loneliness into the inside world of shared fate, fragile hope, and quiet belonging. The stranger came with a slow, uncertain step, often led or supported by a caretaker, a relative, or a guard. They offered a steadying hand, a gentle nod, or a warm look, small gestures that conveyed acceptance. The stranger was led through the gate, the sound of the bell on their wrist joining the chorus that filled the air. The road to the colony was often long and harsh, traveled with aching limbs and heavy hearts. At the gate, the newcomer's arrival was met with a silent, watchful presence. The caretaker who greeted the stranger was often a seasoned resident, someone who had lived within the colony's walls long enough to understand the delicate balance between welcome and caution. Inside, the newcomer's first hours were quiet and carefully guided. Other residents approached slowly, their movements tentative but purposeful. The newcomer listened and watched, absorbing these gestures with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Night brought with it a deeper silence, but also a sense of belonging. Over days and weeks, the stranger's presence became part of the colony's fabric. The newcomer's body bore the marks of disease, but their spirit found nourishment in this new community. Among the residents, the arrival of a new leper was a reminder of the fragile line they all walked. The stranger's story, though often unspoken, became part of the colony's collective memory. In this quiet way, the leper colony remained a place of endings and beginnings, loss and acceptance, despair and hope. Within the stone walls of the leper colony, death was both a familiar presence and a whispered visitor. It did not arrive suddenly or without warning. Instead, it came slowly, gently, like the fading of light at dusk or the soft closing of a door. For those who lived with leprosy, death was often expected, an inevitable passage after years of suffering, isolation, and loss. They might move from the communal workshops and gardens to the quieter infirmary or a small, dimly lit cell. These spaces were simple stone walls, a narrow cot, a rough blanket, but they became sanctuaries where the dying could be cared for with as much tenderness as the colony could offer. And yet, even in its certainty, death carried complexities, fear and relief, sorrow and mercy, the weight of final goodbyes and the quiet hope of peace. These final gatherings were intimate and unspoken, marked by shared glances, clasped hands, and the occasional tear. Words were few. The silence carried the weight of love and loss. Prayers were said, hymns sung softly, and the memory of the departed carried forward in stories and quiet remembrances. When pain became unbearable, when the body was ravaged beyond endurance, the colony's healers might offer herbal remedies to ease suffering. Though limited in their means, these gestures were acts of kindness and mercy. At times, death was swift a blessing in disguise that spared prolonged agony. Many residents dreaded passing without companionship, without a hand to hold or a prayer said. These memories were acts of remembrance, preserving identity beyond the body's decline. Elders sought to shield them from the harshest realities, while gently explaining the cycle of life and death in terms they might understand. Stories of saints, angels, and the promise of peace beyond suffering were told in soft voices at bedtime, offering comfort and hope. Through story, the departed remained part of the community's ongoing life. Within the colony, however, it was reframed, not as shame, but as part of the shared human journey. In the act of dying, the residents found a final expression of vulnerability and strength. Mourning was shared and collective, weaving the community tighter through grief and remembrance. The quiet prayers, the gentle touch, the holding of a hand all spoke of connection beyond words. Children were born, friendships blossomed, work continued, and moments of laughter and joy were found amid sorrow. The residents lived in the tension between life and death, finding meaning in each breath, each shared meal, each prayer. The disruption was felt keenly, the loss raw and immediate. These moments underscored the precariousness of life within the colony and the resilience required to endure. Death was not only an end, but a moment that revealed the deepest truths of compassion and humanity. This shift in perspective was a quiet revolution, a reclaiming of dignity in the face of exclusion. It was a journey traveled together, hand in hand, voice in voice, heart with heart. The colony's strength lay in its commitment to ensure no one died alone. Even in the harshest times, someone was there watching, caring, bearing witness. These included the preparation of the body, the timing of burials, and the marking of graves with simple crosses or stones. Rows of simple markers, weathered by time and elements, stood as testament to countless lives lived and lost. Flowers or herbs, sometimes wild and sometimes carefully tended, grew among the graves, a living reminder of renewal and remembrance. Though modest, these practices provided a framework that honored the deceased and offered solace to the living. Death was woven into the colony's fabric, not as a final silence, but as a passage marked by grace and dignity. The long course of leprosy meant that residents often faced death as a gradual process. Funerals were simple but meaningful affairs, often held within the colony's grounds or in consecrated soil nearby. A coffin might be made by the potters or carpenters within the community, adorned with a cross or sprigs of rosemary. The body was tended with care, wrapped in clean linens, prepared for its final journey. It was a cycle as natural and inexorable as the changing seasons. The grief carried within the colony was tempered by the knowledge that life continued, even amid loss. Their bodies weakened over time, ravaged by wounds that would not heal, by nerves that ceased to feel, by limbs that withered or dropped away. Residents learned early to live with its presence, to recognize its signs, the growing stillness, the weakening breath, the closing eyes, and to prepare themselves emotionally and spiritually. This preparation was a quiet process, shaped by faith, community, and personal courage. It was a slow unraveling of flesh and bone, marked by periods of agony and fleeting ease. To those inside the colony, death was not a single moment, but a lingering shadow that lengthened with every passing day. As a resident's strength waned, their place within the colony shifted. Caregivers, often fellow residents themselves, took on the sacred duty of tending to the dying. They washed sores, changed linens, brought sips of water, and offered words or prayers. Their hands, familiar with disease and decay, were gentle and steady. The line between patient and caretaker blurred in these final moments, united by shared experience and compassion. Death was approached with a mixture of resignation and reverence. For many, it was not feared as an end, but awaited as a release, a crossing from suffering into rest. This perspective was shaped by faith, taught and reinforced by clergy who visited or lived within the colony. Prayers for the dying were whispered daily, invoking saints of healing and mercy. The hope for a gentle passing, for a soul freed from the chains of illness, was a quiet comfort. The dying were often accompanied by a small circle of friends or family, their presence a balm amid the fading light. Though death was expected, it was never easy. The colony's residents mourned deeply for those they lost, their neighbors, their friends, their chosen family. The rituals around death brought the community together, reminding them of their shared humanity and fragile mortality. In some moments, death came as a merciful release. The community also understood that death could bring renewal. The passing of one resident made space for another new lives arriving, old sorrows fading. Death was not a topic spoken of lightly. It was approached with a delicate balance of silence and acknowledgement. The fear of death was often eclipsed by the fear of loneliness. The stories of those who died were carried forward, whispered in the quiet hours, woven into the colony's history. For the children of the colony, death was a confusing and frightening presence. In the broader world, death from leprosy was often seen as a grim fate, a mark of divine punishment or social curse. The presence of death also fostered moments of profound beauty and grace. Over time, the colony developed its own customs around death, a blending of faith, tradition, and practical necessity. The colony's cemetery was a place of silence and memory. Death also shaped the relationships within the colony. It deepened bonds between survivors, reminding them of life's fragility and the preciousness of each day. In the rare moments when death was sudden or violent due to accidents, outbreaks of other illnesses, or despair, the colony responded with somber urgency. Despite the shadow of death, life persisted in the colony. The slow approach of death in the colony was a reminder of the profound human capacity to endure, to meet the inevitable with grace, faith, and community. And when death came, as it always did, it came gently ushered by prayers, cradled by friends, and carried by faith into the next great mystery. Beyond the walls of the leper colony lay the far field, a stretch of earth set apart from the village and the town, a place both feared and revered. This land, rough and often windswept, was the final resting place for those who had lived and died within the colony's boundaries. For the residents of the colony, it was a necessary act, a final farewell that affirmed their humanity, even as it underscored their exile. The graves were modest shallow pits dug by worn hands, marked by simple wooden crosses, stones, or sometimes nothing at all. And yet, within this simplicity lay profound meaning. Here, the lepers were laid to rest, separated from the living world by distance, custom, and a deep-rooted fear of contagion. The body, frail and marked by disease, was carefully washed and wrapped in linens. The colony's residents knew that deeper burial was not always possible, given the tools and the ground conditions. Sometimes names were etched or painted, but often the graves were left unnamed, a reflection of the anonymity imposed by disease and exile. Yet even these humble markers carried weight. They stood as silent witnesses to lives lived and lost, testimonies to the presence of souls who had walked the earth. The shallow graves were covered carefully with earth, stones, or wooden planks to protect from scavengers and the elements. These prayers called for mercy, forgiveness, and peace. They invoked saints known for healing and protection, asking that the departed find rest beyond suffering. Elders spoke gently of the graves, of the need to respect the resting place, and to honor those who had gone before. Every grave marked a loss, every burial a moment of reckoning. For the residents, it was both a place of sorrow and a place of reverence, a testament to endurance and the human spirit. These lessons were part of the colony's unspoken curriculum, shaping how the young understood life, death, and belonging. This was a sacred task, undertaken by caregivers or fellow residents who had formed bonds with the deceased. Their visits were brief and often tinged with unease, reminders of the outside world's fear and misunderstanding. Yet, even in these moments, the far field stood as a quiet sanctuary, a place where those who had been cast out found final peace. The community gathered in small groups, their faces shadowed by grief and faith, a hope carried in the heart, and a promise that no soul would be forgotten, no matter how far from the world they lay. Wildflowers bloomed in spring, swaying in the breeze. Snow blanketed the earth in winter, muffling sounds and softening the landscape. Rain softened the soil, filling the graves with the scent of earth and growth. They were shaped by necessity, faith, and the shared humanity of those who lived and died together. The cycles of nature echoed the cycles of life and death within the colony. Stories of the departed were recalled, softly tales of kindness, courage, or moments of laughter amidst hardship. These memories were gifts, passed down from one resident to another, ensuring that no one was truly forgotten. In these moments, the far field became a sacred space, a place where earth and spirit met. Each grave was a marker of a life, each prayer a bridge between worlds. In this quiet corner of the earth, the lepers found a resting place not only for their bodies, but for their stories, their struggles, and their enduring spirits. Their hands moved with tenderness. Despite the knowledge of danger, their care a testament to love and respect. Burial in the far field was a somber ritual, marked by a mixture of grief, reverence, and resignation. Residents knew that their loved ones lay far from their sight, beyond the colony's gates and the world they once knew. Visits were rare and difficult, limited by illness and access. Yet the memory of the dead lived on in daily prayers, in moments of silence, in the shared grief that united the community. The wrapping was both practical and symbolic, a final act of dignity before the body was taken beyond the walls. Residents and caretakers, burdened by sorrow, moved together through the colony's gates and along the dusty paths leading away from the homes and gardens. The sounds of the living faded with each step, replaced by the whisper of wind and the distant calls of birds. The preparation for burial began soon after death, often at dusk or in the early hours before dawn. The linens were often plain but clean, sometimes scented with herbs from the colony's gardens, lavender, rosemary, or sage, believed to soothe the spirit and guard against evil. Carrying the body to the far field was a slow, deliberate procession. The far field itself was often a stark landscape. Grass grew wild and uneven. The earth cracked in dry seasons and turned to mud in rain. There were no grand monuments or elaborate tombs, only the earth itself and the quiet presence of the departed. In this remoteness, the dead were both honored and kept apart. Graves were dug shallowly, both out of practicality and fear. The markers were simple wooden crosses, carved by the colony's carpenters or made from scrap wood. Prayers accompanied every burial. The colony's chaplain, if one was present, led the rites, words whispered softly in Latin or the local tongue. For those without clergy, the prayers came from neighbors, whispered blessings, shared hymns, or silent meditations. The burial was not merely an act of finality, but a moment of connection. It bound the living to the dead, the past to the present. The distance of the far field was both a protection and a pain. Children in the colony learned early about the far field, the final destination for those who did not survive. The far field also held a quiet warning. It was a reminder of the colony's fragile existence, the thin line between life and death. Seasons passed over the far field, changing its face, but never its significance. Sometimes visitors came clergy, officials, or family members, bringing small offerings or prayers. The burial practices in the leper colony reflected a delicate balance between fear and compassion, separation and connection, despair and hope. Though modest and isolated, the far field was a place of dignity. Burial in the far field was the colony's final act of love, a farewell whispered in the wind. The leper colony, enclosed by its high walls and marked by the suffering of those within, was also a stage upon which the church's presence played a complex and powerful role. Clergy monks, nuns, priests, and bishops came in and out of this world, bearing with them the weight of faith, hope, and sometimes harsh judgment. For many, faith was a lifeline in the darkness, a wellspring of courage and consolation amid pain and isolation. The same hands that brought healing prayers might also enforce exclusion. Some priests and monks came with genuine kindness and humility, offering care to the sick, listening to confessions, and administering the sacraments. Their presence was a balm to many, a reminder that despite their illness and exile, they were still part of the Christian community, beloved children of God. Others saw them as objects of pity or charity, dependent on the church's mercy. Orders were sometimes given that reinforced segregation, that limited the movement of lepers, or that controlled their access to sacraments. These rules, often framed as protection for both the sick and the healthy, underscored the boundaries between inclusion and exclusion. This mixture of feelings often led to complicated relationships. Residents who welcomed help but bristled at pity, who sought spiritual solace but recoiled from judgment. The same voices that recited blessings might whisper words of judgment. This tension shaped how the residents saw themselves and how they were seen by the wider world. Many residents found solace in scripture, in prayer beads, and in simple acts of devotion, lighting a candle, crossing themselves, whispering a song. Monasteries and religious orders sometimes administered the colony, setting rules, managing supplies, and overseeing care. Their authority was both practical and symbolic, embodying the church's role as guardian of souls and bodies. These rituals sustained them, created moments of peace amid hardship, and connected them to a broader spiritual tradition. Processions, hymns, and prayers lifted spirits and reinforced a shared identity beyond disease. Yet even these moments reminded residents of their reliance on divine mercy, a mercy not always felt in the hands of men. In others, it reinforced power imbalances and neglect. The residents experienced the church not only as spiritual guides. It was a gaze that both illuminated and shadowed, that offered healing and imposed boundaries. But as gatekeepers who could grant or withhold resources, permission, and protection. It was a story of faith lived on the margins, a testament to the resilience of the spirit under the watchful eyes of God and man. They found strength in the stories of saints who had borne suffering, in promises of resurrection, and in the vision of a kingdom where illness and exclusion would be no more. Townspeople were reminded to avoid contact, to guard themselves against contamination, and to view lepers as morally tainted. The church was a vast institution, made up of many individuals whose attitudes and actions varied widely. It was through clergy that news traveled, that alms were delivered, that prayers were heard. The church's presence was a reminder that despite exile, they were not wholly forgotten. Confession, while offering spiritual relief, could also expose the resident to judgment or admonishment. The sacramental life of the colony was thus marked by both grace and tension. At times, the church's gaze felt heavy, watchful, judging, distant. At others, it was a gentle touch, a comforting word, a shared prayer. The residents lived in this tension, balancing faith with experience, hope with reality. Their prayers were fervent, their devotion sincere, but they also knew the church's gaze could be a source of shame. They prayed not only for healing, but for acceptance, for a place in a world that often saw them only as unclean. This message deepened stigma and reinforced the walls that kept the colony separate. Daily prayers, rituals, and religious festivals punctuated the rhythm of life, offering moments to connect with something greater than the suffering that defined their days. Saints of healing, stories of miracles, and the promise of eternal peace gave meaning to endurance. They washed wounds, prepared meals, tended the sick, and taught children. Their gentle hands and patient voices brought moments of comfort and dignity. For some residents, the nuns were the closest connection to a world beyond the colony's walls, a reminder that compassion still existed in human form. The church's gaze was both a comfort and a cross to bear, a source of solace and a reminder of exclusion. Religion was woven tightly into the lives of the colony's residents. Yet the church's gaze was never simple or unambiguous. It carried duality's compassion mixed with condescension, salvation mingled with stigma. Clergy visits to the colony were regular but uneven experiences. Nuns, often the caretakers of the infirm, played a vital role in the colony's day-to-day life. Yet even among the clergy, attitudes varied. Some regarded lepers with suspicion or fear, viewing the disease as a divine punishment for sin. The church also played a role in the colony's rules and restrictions. Sermons preached outside the colony's walls sometimes echoed harsh words about sin, curse, and divine wrath. Inside, the residents wrestled with these mixed messages. They were people of faith, but also people cast out. Religious festivals within the colony carried special meaning. Celebrations of saints who healed the sick St. Lazarus, St. Roch, St. Damien were moments of hope and communal strength. Confession and communion were particularly fraught rites. Some clergy hesitated to administer communion to lepers, fearing ritual contamination or scandal. Despite these complexities, faith remained a cornerstone of life. The church's gaze also extended beyond spiritual care into the realm of politics and social order. In some cases, this authority was exercised with compassion and wisdom. Letters, records, and chronicles from the period reveal glimpses of these dynamic clerics pleading for funds, bishops condemning sin, monks tending the sick with devotion, nuns advocating for better care. For the residents, the church was often their only connection to the world beyond the colony. Yet this connection was a fragile thread. In the quiet moments alone in a cell, gathered in prayer, walking the garden paths, the lepers turned inward, seeking peace in their beliefs. The church, for all its contradictions, remained a beacon. It shaped the colony's life, its rituals, and its meaning. Ultimately, the relationship between the leper colony and the church was a mirror of the human condition full of grace and struggle, love and fear, judgment and mercy. When night descended over the leper colony, a hush would fall across its stone walls and narrow lanes. The flickering light of candles and hearth fires dimmed, replaced by the deeper darkness of rooms, filled with quiet breaths in restless sleep. For many residents, night was not just a time of rest, but a journey one that carried them far from the shadows of their present, into the warmth of memories and dreams. The rough calluses of a farmer's hands, the gentle touch of a mother smoothing a child's hair, the firm grip of a craftsman shaping wood or stone, these sensations lived on in the deepest parts of memory. The sound of joy once shared with family and friends, the quick, bright bursts of children playing in sunlit fields, the easy camaraderie of neighbors gathered around a fire, the quiet chuckle of a loved one sharing a story. These moments, though distant, were alive in the night, fragile yet unbroken. To feel again the solid press of flesh against flesh was a longing as urgent as breath itself. Sometimes they were tinged with sorrow or regret, visions of missed opportunities, harsh words spoken in anger, moments when illness first crept in and hope began to fade. Many had arrived too young to fully remember the world beyond the walls. Their dreams filled the gaps, pictures of mothers' faces, the sound of birdsong, the feel of grass, beneath bare feet. These nocturnal visions shaped their sense of self and belonging, weaving a fragile thread to a past they barely knew. Saints and angels might visit in luminous form, promising peace or healing. These spiritual dreams strengthened faith and resilience, reminding the residents that their suffering was not without meaning. In quiet moments, they might share tales of the world beyond, helping residents build mental bridges to what had been and what might still be. Yet even in these, there was a recognition of life's fullness, the mixture of joy and pain that defines human existence. Dreams faded into memory, then into the long hours of waiting and endurance. They dreamed not only of the past, but of healing a future where bodies might be whole again, where stigma might lift, where they might once more touch, laugh, work, and love freely. These dreams fed the spirit, fueling the courage to face each new day. Still, the night's visions lingered, a source of strength when days grew dark. In the quiet solitude of the night, the lepers often found themselves transported back to a world that felt almost like another lifetime, a world filled with the simple pleasures and vibrant moments of a life before. Disease claimed their bodies and changed their destinies. They were a quiet sanctuary, a place where the heart could soar beyond illness and exile. They recalled festivals celebrated before exile, the songs sung around hearth fires. To dream was to assert existence, to hold on to the threads of a life that sickness and stigma threatened to unravel. In sleep, the lepers reclaimed their stories and their humanity, the simple acts of kindness that had once marked their days. These recollections were not just nostalgia, but a way of preserving identity and hope. These dreams were bittersweet, carrying both comfort and pain, hope and longing. In dreams, the residents walked beyond the gates, through village streets, over rolling hills, beneath endless skies. They saw markets bustling with life, fields heavy with harvest, rivers sparkling in the sun. These visions offered escape, a brief freedom from the reality of their exile. They dreamed of touch of hands that were whole and strong, of embraces that once warmed their bodies and hearts. Many remembered tables set with warm meals, the smell of fresh bread and stew wafting through the kitchen. They recalled faces, parents, siblings, children etched with love and sometimes regret. Some dreamed of lost children, taken too soon or left behind. Others of parents' hands and voices, guiding and comforting. Family was a tapestry woven with threads of love, loss, and yearning. Laughter, too, echoed softly in their dreams. Family was at the heart of these dreams. Work, the daily labor that once gave rhythm and purpose, also lived vividly in the dreams of the colony's residents. They saw themselves tilling fields, weaving cloth, hammering nails, or tending flocks. The familiar sounds of tools, the smell of earth or smoke, the feel of steady effort under the sun returned to them in these nocturnal journeys. Work was not just a task, but an identity, a connection to the world outside that the disease had stolen. These dreams were not always perfect or peaceful. For the children in the colony, dreams were especially precious. Elders often spoke quietly of these dreams, sharing stories that blended memory and imagination. The colony's walls, though confining, could not contain the reach of memory. Sometimes dreams carried warnings or messages. A loved one lost might appear, a whisper of caution or comfort. The act of dreaming itself was a form of resistance against the erasure of self, against the isolation imposed by disease. The colony's caretakers understood the power of dreams. They encouraged storytelling, songs, and prayers that nurtured memory and hope. Yet the dawn always brought return to aching limbs, to the harsh light of day, to the realities of wounds and exclusion. For many residents, the hope woven into dreams was fragile but persistent. In the deepest hours of the night, when the colony was silent save for the steady rhythm of breathing and the occasional sigh, the dreams flowed. And when the first light of dawn brushed the rooftops, The residents awoke carrying the warmth of those dreams within them, soft embers of memory and hope, guiding them through the long day ahead. At the heart of the leper colony stood the chapel, a humble structure of stone and timber, weathered by years of wind and rain. Though small and often overlooked by the outside world, this sacred space was a sanctuary, a quiet heart beating steadily amid hardship and exile. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of beeswax candles, worn pews, and old stone warmed by sunlight filtering through narrow, stained glass windows. These colors, deep blues, reds, and golds, cast shifting patterns on the rough floor, creating moments of quiet beauty that contrasted with the harshness outside. It was within these walls that the spirit of the community was most deeply felt, where traces of lives lived, prayers offered, and hope sustained lingered like whispers in the air. Each carved bench bore the marks of countless hands, scratches, initials and symbols left behind by those who had sought comfort here. Residents knelt or sat quietly, fingers entwined in rosaries or clutching small wooden crosses. These moments of devotion were intimate and profound, a private conversation with God that sustained the soul through illness and loneliness. Some were simple crosses, others delicate floral motifs or dates marking a visit or a prayer. Baptisms of children born within the colony, weddings between residents who found love amid suffering, and funerals for those passing beyond were marked here. Each rite was simple but deeply significant, affirming life, love, and community despite the hardships. The act of singing together was a balm away to transcend pain, to assert identity, and to connect with the divine. Children playing softly during services, friends sharing stories afterward, moments of human warmth woven into the fabric of faith. Roof beams groaned under heavy snow, walls bore cracks from shifting earth, and times of scarcity meant candles were scarce. Yet the community's commitment never wavered. Repairs were made by residents skilled in carpentry and masonry, acts of care that strengthened both building and spirit. It held the echoes of generations who had sought refuge there, who had knelt in prayer, sung hymns, and found moments of peace. They remind us that even in places marked by exclusion and pain, the human spirit finds ways to speak, to create, and to connect. Their presence was a reminder of connection beyond the colony, a bridge between two worlds that often seemed divided. Potters made simple vessels for holy water, weavers crafted altar cloths, and carvers shaped wooden crosses and prayer beads. These creations embodied the creative spirit alive, even amid suffering, a testament to resilience and faith. Your support helps bring these forgotten histories to light and keeps these voices alive. Don't forget to like the video if you found it meaningful, and share it with friends who appreciate stories that deepen our understanding of the past. Morning sun cast golden beams through stained glass, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits. Candle flames flickered in the evening, casting shadows that seemed to whisper stories of the past. Through stories of hardship, hope, and enduring spirit, we've glimpsed a world often hidden from history, where humanity shone even in the darkest of times. The chapel's echoes, the dreams of a life before, the prayers and quiet strength remind us that behind every scar was a soul longing to be seen, heard, and remembered. This interplay of light and shadow echoed the community's own journey moments of hope amid darkness, and prayers of a community that refused to be forgotten. Its echoes invite us to listen to hear not only the words spoken, but the silence between, the breath held in prayer, and the enduring light of faith. Yet even in these visits, the residents maintained a quiet dignity, asserting their humanity through faith and fellowship. Even when words failed or breath was short, the melody carried strength. A child might sit tracing the grain of a pew with curious fingers. An elder might rest their weary body against a pillar, eyes closed in silent meditation. These small acts of presence created a shared sanctuary within the chapel's walls. These carvings told stories of presence and belonging, silent testimonies of lives that refused to be erased. It bore a simple wooden cross, a cloth embroidered with symbols of faith, and occasionally small offerings, wildflowers, a carved token, or a carefully folded prayer. These gestures spoke volumes about devotion and the desire to connect with the sacred. The chapel's worn wooden doors creaked softly on their hinges as residents entered, some leaning on crutches, others supported by companions, all seeking refuge from the daily trials beyond. And compassion, and the occasional inscription left by a resident seeking to leave a trace of themselves in stone. Over time, the chapel had become a tapestry of human expression, woven from faith, hope, and resilience. The chapel was more than a place of worship. It was a repository of memories and meaning. The walls, too, bore their own marks, faint outlines of chalk prayers, faded frescoes depicting saints known for healing. Songs were an essential thread in this tapestry. Voices rose in hymns and chants, sometimes full and clear, sometimes trembling with weakness, but always united in purpose. At times, the chapel was filled with the soft murmur of prayers, spoken aloud or whispered in the heart. The chapel was also a place of ritual and ceremony. Visitors, clergy, relatives, or occasionally townsfolk were sometimes welcomed in the chapel. Light played a special role in the chapel. The chapel's altar, though modest, was the focal point of many prayers. In the quiet corners, residents often found space for reflection and solace. The chapel also held the echoes of laughter and whispered conversations, the lighter moments that balanced the weight of illness and exile. Throughout the years, the chapel weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical. Artisans among the lepers contributed to the chapel's character. The chapel's story was intertwined with that of the colony itself, a chronicle of endurance, compassion, and quiet rebellion against erasure. Today, those echoes remain a presence felt in the worn stone, the carved wood, the soft light, and the lingering scent of incense and candle wax. The chapel is more than stone and timber. It is memory made manifest, a sacred vessel holding the stories, hopes. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the lives of those who lived within the medieval leper colony. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to the channel. Feel free to leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts or any questions you have about life in the leper colony or other historical topics you'd like to explore. Thank you again for watching. Until next time, take care and remember the past is never as distant as it seems.